They say weddings bring families together, but mine used my big day as the perfect moment to tear me apart. I spent $20,000 flying my entire family to celebrate the start of my marriage. Flights booked hotel suites, reserved every detail planned so they'd feel honored. But when the music started and the doors opened, their seats were empty. Not a single one of them showed up. Instead, my phone buzzed with a picture from Hawaii. My parents, my sister, everyone I had paid for laughing in sunglasses with cocktails in hand. And the message beneath it: "You're not worth seeing in a wedding dress." Imagine reading that while standing in your gown, holding back tears in front of guests, asking, "Where's your family?" But here's where they made the mistake that would cost them everything. An hour later, I posted one single photo with my groom. What they didn't know was the man they dismissed as not good enough was a $5 billion tycoon who had been quietly building an empire while they mocked him. Their laughter in Hawaii turned into panic in minutes. The family that abandoned me suddenly begged for a flight back, swearing they'd make it right. My answer was simple: too late. If you think that was the end of the story, you're wrong. Because what followed wasn't just revenge, it was a reckoning they never saw coming. And by the end, they would lose far more than just a wedding invitation. Sarah Thompson was 32 years old, a woman who had built her life from determination and sacrifice. As the founder of a small but thriving marketing agency, she had carved out her success without the safety net of family support. She lived in a quiet neighborhood just outside the city, her days consumed with clients and deadlines, her evenings with David, the man she had chosen to marry. To outsiders, she looked like a woman who had everything. But those who knew her closely understood that much of Sarah's drive came from an unhealed wound, the constant longing for her family's approval, a hunger that had shaped nearly every decision she had made. Planning her wedding became more than a celebration. It was her chance to finally create the picture of family unity she had dreamed of since childhood. She wasn't content with simply inviting her parents and sister. She wanted to remove every barrier that might keep them from showing up. That was why she poured $20,000 into arranging their travel. She booked their flights herself, choosing comfortable departure times so they wouldn't have to fuss over connections. She reserved luxury suites at a waterfront hotel each with balconies and ocean views, wanting them to feel special and honored. She coordinated private cars to pick them up at the airport and drive them directly to the venue. Sarah didn't look at the cost as extravagant it was in her mind an investment. "If I make everything easy for them," she told herself, "they'll have no reason not to be there. This time they'll finally see how much I care." This was not the first time Sarah had taken on the role of provider. For years she had been the family's safety net, the one to call when bills were late, when a car broke down, or when a birthday party stretched their finances too far. She wrote checks without complaint, telling herself it was what good daughters did. She covered Christmas gifts when her parents' credit cards were full, contributed to Michelle's children's school tuition, and even bailed her father out of a tax penalty once, all quietly, all with the hope that her generosity might buy her a sliver of the love she rarely received. Each act of giving had been carried out with a silent prayer. "Maybe this time they'll be proud of me." In contrast, David never asked her to prove herself. A tech consultant who worked quietly behind the scenes for companies that needed digital security, he was steady, unpretentious, and deeply loyal. He didn't boast about his contracts or talk endlessly about the money he was earning, though Sarah noticed the confidence with which he carried himself. What mattered most to her was the way he listened. When she confessed her fear that her family might not take her wedding seriously, he didn't dismiss her. He squeezed her hand and said, "Then we'll make it our day, and I'll stand with you no matter what." His quiet reassurance soothed her, but in Sarah's heart she still held on to the hope that if she made the day grand enough, her family would finally embrace her with open arms. That hope spilled into every detail of her preparations. She wrote letters to each family member, slipping them into envelopes with her best stationery. To her parents, she wrote about how their example had shaped her, about the years she had looked up to them as proof that love could endure. To Michelle, she wrote about sisterhood, about how much it meant to her to have her standing beside her when she walked down the aisle. These weren't ordinary notes. They were confessions, tokens of vulnerability she hoped would touch their hearts. Sarah sealed them with care, imagining the tears in their eyes when they read them. She wanted her family to know that they weren't just guests at her wedding, they were the foundation of it. Yet as she poured her soul into every gesture, the responses from her family landed with the dull weight of indifference. When she called her mother to share about the hotel suites, her mother replied flatly, "That's nice." When she excitedly told her father about the welcome dinner, he murmured, "We'll see." Michelle, when told about the handwritten vows Sarah was preparing, responded with a laughing emoji as if the effort were excessive. Each lukewarm reaction was like a drop of cold water on Sarah's flame of excitement, but she pushed the feeling away. "They're busy," she reassured herself. "They'll understand when they see it all come together." She clung to that belief as she typed out a message to the family group chat, her fingers lingering over the keyboard as though the words themselves might carry magic. "Tickets booked. Can't wait to celebrate with my family," she wrote. She added a heart at the end, hoping to soften the edges, then pressed send. For a moment she stared at the screen, waiting for the flood of replies. Her mother's exclamation marks her father's rare thumbs up, Michelle's teasing jokes. 3 hours later, the message showed read beneath each name, but not a single reply appeared. Sarah watched the silence linger on the group chat screen. Her hopeful message unanswered, and it brought back an ache she had carried for as long as she could remember. This was not the first time her excitement had been met with indifference. It had been this way since childhood, when every moment of her life seemed to orbit around Michelle, her older sister, the one her parents adored without reservation. Michelle was the golden child, the daughter who could do no wrong, while Sarah was the shadow trailing behind, working twice as hard for half the notice. When Michelle brought home a report card filled with average grades, their mother baked a cake to celebrate her effort. When Sarah earned straight A's, there was no fanfare, no congratulations, just a distracted comment about how she was supposed to do well. Sarah remembered watching the frosting being spread across that cake, the smell of sugar filling the kitchen, and feeling a hollowness in her chest. No matter how she excelled, her achievements would never be enough to compete with Michelle's effortless charm. Their parents laughed louder at Michelle's jokes, clapped more proudly at her recitals, and defended her when teachers raised concerns. Meanwhile, Sarah's successes were expected. Her mistakes magnified, her needs brushed aside. The pattern of favoritism grew more painful as the girls grew older. Michelle wanted a car for her 16th birthday, and even though money was tight, her parents found a way to buy a used convertible, showering her with balloons and friends for a driveway reveal. Sarah, 2 years younger, received her sister's old sedan, a hand-me-down with torn upholstery and a broken radio. She smiled for the photo her parents snapped, knowing a complaint would be met with accusations of being ungrateful. That was the rhythm of her life Michelle celebrated for mediocrity. Sarah chastised for daring to want recognition. The greatest wound came when Sarah was 17, holding an acceptance letter to Yale in trembling hands. It was the opportunity of a lifetime, the culmination of years of late-night study sessions and sacrifices she had made without complaint. She imagined herself stepping onto that campus, finally proving she was more than the background player in her family's story. But when she told her parents, her mother pursed her lips and said, "That's too far. Family comes first." Her father added, "Michelle's decided to attend community college here. She'll need us around. You'll understand, Sarah. Michelle needs us more." And just like that, the dream she had built crumbled. Sarah gave up her scholarship, smiling tightly, while her sister basked in attention for enrolling at a college that didn't even require an entrance essay. She never told her parents about the nights she cried into her pillow, mourning the life she might have had. Her father's role in all of this was never one of protection. He stood by silently when her mother compared the sisters, sometimes even adding fuel with his own comments. "Michelle has the kind of personality people love," he would say, "and you, Sarah, you're serious." "That's fine. Serious people work hard." It was never said with pride, only resignation, as though her very nature was something to tolerate rather than celebrate. Sarah learned early that she could not rely on him to defend her. His loyalty was always with her mother's perspective, reinforcing the imbalance that defined their family. In the absence of recognition, Sarah developed her coping strategy. She became the overachiever, the one who stayed late to perfect every project, the girl who volunteered for every committee, the young woman who tried to meet everyone else's needs before they had to ask. If she couldn't win her family's love outright, maybe she could earn it with tireless effort. But no matter how many awards lined her shelf, no matter how many responsibilities she took on, the approval she craved remained just out of reach. Her smile grew practiced, her gratitude rehearsed, masking the sting of knowing her best was never enough. The favoritism extended far beyond their home, seeping into the way family, friends, and the community perceived the sisters. At church gatherings and neighborhood picnics, Michelle was introduced as the fun daughter, the one with the easy laugh and sparkling personality. Sarah was introduced as the serious one, a label that stuck to her like a weight. People teased her for her studiousness, praised Michelle for her charisma, never realizing how deeply those words carved into Sarah's sense of self. Even as adults, the contrast persisted. Michelle was the social butterfly, Sarah the dependable worker. And though Sarah's accomplishments outshone her sisters by every objective measure, she remained in Michelle's shadow, unseen and unappreciated. So when Sarah poured herself into planning her wedding, when she invested not just her money but her heart into making the event a celebration of family, it was not just about the day itself. It was about rewriting the story she had lived for decades. It was her attempt to finally bring balance to a scale that had always been tipped against her. Yet even as she spoke of her plans, even as her voice trembled with the hope that maybe this time would be different, the familiar patterns resurfaced. At their last family dinner before the wedding, Sarah carefully brought up her plans, her eyes searching her mother's face for some sign of excitement, some flicker of approval. Instead, her mother sighed, setting down her fork with a look of weary indulgence. "Don't get your hopes up, honey. You always expect too much from people." The words from her mother's lips at dinner, warning her not to expect too much, lingered in Sarah's mind long after she left the table. It was a familiar echo of the doubts planted throughout her life, and yet when she returned home to David, she felt an immediate shift. He smiled at her without needing explanation, as though he already knew the battles she had fought in silence. Where her family saw flaws or reasons to dismiss her, David saw strength. He had always seen her that way from the very first moment they met. David was not the kind of man who commanded attention in a crowded room, but the kind who built trust quietly, steadily, until people leaned on him without realizing how much they depended on his calm presence. David ran a cybersecurity consulting firm from a modest office downtown. The space wasn't decorated with sleek furniture or corporate plaques, but with coffee cups, sticky notes, and a handful of thank you cards from clients who appreciated his dedication. His company specialized in protecting small businesses from data breaches, and he treated each contract with the seriousness of a soldier defending a fortress. Though the firm was modest in size, David's knowledge and work ethic had earned him contracts with organizations far larger than his office suggested. Sarah sometimes caught glimpses of the scope of his work when he mentioned a government contract in passing, or when she saw the stack of non-disclosure agreements he kept locked away. Yet he never bragged, never made his success into a badge of superiority. Instead, he found fulfillment in volunteering at community centers, teaching young people how to protect themselves online, showing teenagers from rough neighborhoods that they could build futures in technology. When Sarah introduced David to her family through video calls, the reaction was nothing like the warmth she had hoped for. Her mother's first comment was, "He's so quiet. Don't you want someone more outgoing?" Her father frowned and asked, "Where's his ambition? Does he plan to grow that little business of his?" Michelle chuckled and chimed in, "Sarah, you could do so much better." Their words landed like darts, not aimed to wound David. He didn't seem bothered, but aimed squarely at Sarah, reinforcing the idea that she had chosen poorly. Sarah defended him gently at first, explaining that his work was meaningful, that he valued stability over showmanship, but the more she tried, the more dismissive their tone became. What stung most was their hypocrisy. They exalted Michelle's husband Tom, a man who wore expensive suits and drove a polished car, but carried debts Sarah knew he could barely manage. He was always talking about his next big project, his connections with influential people, though none of those ventures ever seemed to yield results. Still, the family praised him endlessly, calling him ambitious and successful, turning a blind eye to the cracks beneath the surface. Sarah couldn't help but notice the double standard. Tom's empty promises were celebrated while David's steady accomplishments were dismissed as unremarkable. It was a reflection of the values her family had always held: surface over substance, appearance over truth. Sarah knew the truth about David, though. She saw it in the late nights when he pored over client files, ensuring no loophole would leave them vulnerable. She saw it in the way he never turned down a call from a panicked business owner, treating each client's crisis as though it were his own. She knew about the contracts that hinted at a level of success far beyond what her family imagined, contracts he downplayed, because boasting simply wasn't in his nature. David's worth was not measured in showy gestures, but in his quiet reliability, his integrity, his refusal to compromise his values. Sarah admired him deeply for it, but still she longed for her family to recognize what she did. Her mind often wandered back to a painful memory of another relationship, one that might have ended differently if not for her family's interference. Years ago, she had been engaged to a kind man named Mark, someone who cared for her deeply. But as the engagement wore on, Sarah noticed her parents whispering to him at gatherings, Michelle pulling him aside with feigned concern. "Are you sure Sarah isn't too career-driven?" her mother would ask. "Or she can be a little cold, don't you think?" Michelle confided to him once that Sarah wasn't as affectionate as she seemed. Over time, those seeds of doubt grew. Mark grew distant, then restless, until one evening he ended the engagement, saying he didn't think Sarah could ever give him the family warmth he wanted. Only later did Sarah discover how her family had chipped away at his confidence in her, their subtle sabotage successful once again. With David, Sarah vowed not to let their opinions ruin what she had found. And yet she carried a gnawing ache. She defended him fiercely during calls, listing his accomplishments, describing his kindness, but her words always sounded like pleas for validation. Deep inside, she still craved that nod of approval from her mother, that rare moment of pride from her father. She wanted them to look at David and see what she saw, a man who grounded her, who loved her without conditions, who was building a life of real strength beside her. One afternoon, sitting across from her mother with her heart pounding, Sarah pulled out their engagement photo. It was a simple picture, David holding her hand, both of them smiling softly at each other, the kind of quiet joy that didn't need fanfare. She offered it like an olive branch, hoping for even a flicker of warmth in return. Her mother barely glanced at it before turning away, her lips pursed in dismissal. "Well," she said, her tone cool, "I suppose he'll have to do." Sarah held the sting of her mother's words close, the casual dismissal of her fiancé hanging in her chest like a stone. It should have been enough to sour her excitement, but instead she buried herself even deeper in wedding preparations, determined to craft an event so beautiful, so full of meaning, that her family would have no choice but to see her and David differently. She approached each decision with precision, not as a bride seeking luxury for herself, but as a daughter, trying once again to create the illusion of belonging. She started with the photographer, a name Michelle had pressed into her hand with unusual enthusiasm. His portfolio was undeniably impressive, pages filled with couples bathed in golden light, their joy immortalized in frames fit for magazines. Sarah booked him quickly, grateful for what she thought was her sister's support. When the photographer insisted on a large deposit and asked persistent questions about her family's role in the wedding, she brushed off her discomfort as nerves. Surely this was just professional thoroughness, she told herself. She wanted the day documented perfectly, every smile, every embrace, especially those moments that might finally show her parents' pride. Beyond the photographs, Sarah poured herself into details designed to honor her family. She began working late into the night on a tribute video celebrating her parents' marriage. She sifted through old photos of them laughing in their youth snapshots from family vacations and images of her and Michelle as little girls. She layered the pictures with soft music, imagining her parents watching in the reception hall, tears of nostalgia softening whatever edges remained between them. It was her way of saying, "See, I honor you. I love you. Please love me back." Her vows, carefully written in longhand, carried the same weight. Though they were meant for David, she wove into them references to family unity, to the way love was not only the foundation of a marriage, but the thread that kept families strong through hardship. She practiced them quietly in her bedroom, her eyes misting as she imagined her parents sitting in the audience nodding, finally recognizing that she had built a life grounded in values they should have admired. Each word was chosen to bridge the gap between what she had always given and what she had always hoped to receive. But even as Sarah created these intimate gestures, small cracks began to appear in the facade. One evening, while scrolling through her phone, she stumbled upon something she wasn't meant to see. A post shared between relatives revealed the existence of a family group chat, one buzzing with messages, inside jokes, and what looked like planning. She searched her own phone in confusion. There had been no notifications, no updates. Then it hit her she wasn't included. Whatever they were planning, they were doing it without her. For a long moment she just stared at the screen, her throat tight. The omission wasn't an oversight. It was deliberate. The unease only deepened as she reached out for wedding details. When she asked her mother about arrival times, the response was clipped. "We'll let you know." Her father gave a vague, "Don't worry about us." Michelle read her messages without reply. Yet on social media they were vibrant, posting about lunches with friends, gardening projects, and weekend getaways. To the world they were lively and engaged. To Sarah they offered nothing but silence. She told herself it was just distraction, that they would surely become more involved as the wedding drew near. But the contrast between their public presence and their private indifference cut like glass. Her best friend Maria noticed the pattern before Sarah was ready to admit it. Sitting across from her one afternoon as Sarah arranged ribbons for the reception, Maria tilted her head and asked gently, "They seem distant lately. Are you sure they're coming?" Sarah's hands froze mid-knot, her smile tightening. "Of course they're coming," she said, though the words sounded brittle even to her own ears. Maria didn't push further, but the warning lingered like a shadow over Sarah's excitement. Still, she pressed forward. She could not allow herself to unravel so close to the day she had been planning all her life. She rehearsed the walk down the aisle in her mind, imagining her parents waiting in the front row, Michelle by her side. She reminded herself of the deposits she had paid, the arrangements she had made, all to ensure their comfort. Surely they would see her effort. Surely they would show up. Yet the silence from Michelle gnawed at her more than anything. 4 times now she had texted about hotel details, needing confirmation for the reservations she had already secured. 4 times the message had been read, the little notification on her screen mocking her with its proof of indifference. And 4 times no response had come. That night, scrolling through her feed with a mix of frustration and dread, Sarah saw Michelle's latest post, a beach at sunset, the sky blazing orange over rolling waves. The caption read, "Much needed escape." Sarah stared at it, her heart pounding, the unanswered message still glowing on her phone. Sarah stared at Michelle's beach post until the colors blurred her phone, trembling in her hand. The unanswered message about hotel details still glowed on her screen, a reminder of the wall of silence that had grown higher and higher with every day. She told herself not to overreact, not to let anxiety win, but as the hours passed, her need for answers became unbearable. The next morning she dialed her mother, rehearsing a cheerful tone, as if enthusiasm might coax out a reply. "Hi, Mom. Just checking in, wanted to make sure your flights are all set. I can't wait to see you tomorrow. Love you." She ended the call quickly, almost breathless, and stared at the phone, waiting for the little bubble of reply. Nothing came. By afternoon, she tried again, the smile in her voice tighter. "Hi, it's me again. Just confirming the arrival time. Everything is booked, the rooms are ready. Call me back, okay?" When evening fell, her voice was no longer steady. The words came halting, her throat catching. "Please, I just need to hear from you. Even a quick text." She hated how desperate she sounded, hated the thin, pleading edge in her own tone, but the silence was worse. She left similar messages for her father and for Michelle, each one a little less polished, a little more raw. By the third day, Sarah replayed her own voicemails in her head, cringing at the sound of herself begging into the void. 2 days before the wedding, she couldn't stand the uncertainty anymore. She grabbed her keys and drove to her parents' house, telling David she needed to drop something off, though in truth she was chasing reassurance. As she pulled into the driveway, her stomach sank. The lawn was overgrown weeds sprouting defiantly through the cracks. A week's worth of mail stuffed the box envelopes, curling at the edges. Sarah knocked on the door, then pressed the bell. No footsteps, no voices, just the echo of her own presence. Peering through the glass, she saw dust gathering on the entryway table, a home abandoned in a hurry. Her hands shook against the doorknob. "Where are you?" she whispered, but the house gave her nothing. Back in the car, she refreshed her phone, and the truth cut deeper. Michelle had posted a photo of herself at a cafe with the caption, "Caffeine before adventure." Her father had checked in at a golf course. Her mother had commented on a neighbor's flower arrangement. They were not missing. They were active, visible, choosing to engage everywhere, but with her. On Sarah's own posts, wedding updates filled with flowers programs and excited countdowns, her family was silent. No likes, no comments, as though her life events existed in a different dimension they had no interest in acknowledging. Vendors began to notice. The photographer asked when her parents would arrive for family shots. The caterer needed to know dietary restrictions. The florist wondered whether her mother wanted roses or lilies. Sarah laughed too quickly, her explanations flimsy. "They're just last-minute people," she said. To Maria, she gave other excuses, blaming work schedules and distractions. Each excuse was another stitch in the fragile net she cast around herself, a net she knew could not hold. David noticed. He watched her fumble through conversations, her fingers trembling as she typed new messages, and his eyes softened with concern. One evening, he knelt beside her chair, taking her cold hands in his. "Sarah," he said quietly, "I don't want you to be blindsided. If they don't come, it's not because of you. It's because of them." She shook her head fiercely, blinking back tears. "They wouldn't do that," she whispered, but the conviction wavered in her voice. David didn't argue, only held her hands tighter, the silence between them saying what he couldn't. Desperate for some kind of clarity, Sarah reached out to extended family. She called her Aunt Carol, her father's sister, hoping someone outside the circle might ease her fears. Carol answered warmly at first. But when Sarah asked about her parents' travel plans, the pause on the other end spoke volumes. "Oh, honey," Carol said cautiously, "I thought they were already with you." Confusion clouded Sarah's mind. She pressed for details, but Carol's tone grew evasive. "You know your mother, she likes surprises. I'm sure everything is fine." The words rang hollow. The call ended, leaving Sarah with more questions than comfort. The night before the wedding, Sarah sat on her bed dress bag, hanging nearby, her phone in her lap. Her heart thudded as she refreshed her feed again. Michelle's story appeared at the top, bright and unmissable. With a shaking finger, Sarah opened it. A tropical sunset filled the screen, waves rolling beneath tall palm trees. The caption read, "Paradise Found." In the corner, the location tag pulsed like a cruel confirmation, Maui, Hawaii. The morning of her wedding began in a haze of nerves and hope. But beneath the surface, Sarah's heart beat in uneven rhythms, each one fueled by the silence of her phone. She woke before dawn, staring at the ceiling, then rolled over to check her messages for the 100th time. No calls, no texts, no reassuring note from her mother or sister telling her they were on the way. Her bridesmaids tried to create an atmosphere of joy, bustling around with curling irons and champagne flutes, laughing too loudly as if noise could cover the absence. Sarah smiled and nodded at their chatter, but her hands trembled as she scrolled again, refreshing the screen until her thumb ached. Still nothing. Every cheerful, "You look beautiful," from her friends was met with a mechanical, "Thank you," her thoughts drifting to the empty chairs she feared she would face. By the time she stepped into her gown, her nerves were raw. The satin clung tightly to her frame, but instead of feeling radiant, she felt exposed. Each time her phone buzzed, she lunged toward it only to see another vendor's confirmation or a friend's congratulations. David had sent a simple message that morning. "Whatever happens, I'm here." His steady words steadied her for a moment, but the gnawing silence from her family consumed her again. She tucked her phone away as the hairdresser added final touches, whispering to herself that maybe they would surprise her at the last moment, that maybe they were already waiting at the church. The ceremony began in a wash of music and candlelight, but as Sarah stepped into the aisle, her stomach twisted. The rows of seats reserved for family stretched empty white ribbons tied neatly across them, each one a mocking reminder of who was missing. Guests shifted in their seats, whispers rising like smoke. "Where's her family? Did something happen?" Sarah forced her lips into a smile, her veil trembling with each step. The love in David's eyes steadied her, but the absence pressed down louder than the organ music, heavier than the bouquet she clutched. The photographer moved around her camera, clicking incessantly, but his lens seemed drawn to the wrong moments. Instead of capturing her tentative smile at the altar or David's hand brushing hers, he aimed his lens at her hesitation. Her faltering steps, the glassy look in her eyes when she glanced at the empty front row. Sarah noticed her unease growing, but told herself she was imagining it. Maybe all brides felt scrutinized. Still, when he lingered near her during the vows, his camera angled to catch the flicker of uncertainty, a chill crept through her veil. Then came the vibration against her hip. Sarah slipped her hand into her clutch as the ceremony ended, glancing down at the screen. A photo filled the display, her mother, father, and Michelle lounging by a resort pool in matching sunglasses, drinks in hand. Behind them stretched the turquoise ocean of Hawaii. The caption beneath read, "Finally relaxing. Wish you were here." Her breath caught the phone nearly slipping from her hand. Guests leaned close, whispering congratulations, oblivious to the cruel dagger that had just landed in her chest. Her pulse roared in her ears, drowning out their kind words. At the reception, the photographer became even bolder. Sarah caught him angling shots from the side, her face half lit with confusion, her eyes darting toward the phone she could not stop checking. He ignored David's joyful toasts, Maria's heartfelt speech, the laughter of friends rallying around her. He only seemed to wait for Sarah's weakness, for the falter in her smile. Unease hardened into suspicion. Why did his camera seem intent on documenting her pain? Hours later, while guests danced and plates clattered, Sarah slipped away to the bathroom. Her body trembled as she locked the door, pressing her palms to the cool marble counter. She caught her reflection in the mirror, a bride in white mascara smudging at the edges, eyes rimmed with red. The dress, once a dream, now felt like a costume mocking her. The betrayal wasn't neglect, she realized with a jolt. It was deliberate, orchestrated, cruelly designed. They had not simply chosen a vacation over her wedding. They had chosen to humiliate her. The weight of years of quiet rejection crashed down all at once, and for a long moment she could only grip the counter to steady herself. When she finally gathered the courage to return, she found the dance floor alive, but the photographer was gone. Vanished. David stood at the edge of the room, his expression grim, a phone in his hand. He walked toward her, his voice low, steady, but heavy with truth. "The booking confirmation shows this was paid for with your card," he said, holding out the screen. "But the instructions came from your mother's email." Sarah's hands trembled as David's words sank in. Her mother's email. Her own credit card. The truth struck harder than the silence ever had. This was not neglect, not some careless mistake. It was a decision deliberate and cruel. The weight of the discovery pressed down on her chest, and before anyone could see the tears welling in her eyes, she slipped away, retreating back to the same marble bathroom where she had first faced the emptiness of the day. Inside, the light felt harsh, unforgiving. The gown that had once made her heart race with anticipation now clung to her like a mocking disguise. She had dreamed of floating in it radiant and joyful, but at that moment it felt suffocating heavy with the burden of her family's rejection. Mascara streaked down her cheeks, dark lines tracing the story of a daughter who had spent her life reaching for hands that never reached back. She pressed her palms against the counter, breathing unevenly, staring at a face she barely recognized. The bride looking back at her seemed hollow, emptied of hope. Memories surged without invitation, rushing through her like a cruel montage. She saw herself as a girl proudly handing over a report card filled with straight A's, only to hear her mother dismiss it with, "Well, Michelle tried her best, and that's what counts." She remembered the sting of watching her sister receive a car for her 16th birthday, while she got a second-hand bicycle and a lecture about being responsible. She recalled nights she worked double shifts in college to send money home, only to learn later it had gone toward Michelle's vacations. Each image was another cut, another reminder that her worth had never been enough for them, no matter how hard she tried. She pulled her phone from her clutch, desperate for something, anything that might explain the unexplainable. Her thumb hovered, then pressed her mother's number. The call rang and rang before it went to voicemail. For one wild second, she hoped for a message of apology, an explanation that might soften the wound. Instead, her mother's voice filled the speaker light and carefree. "Hi there. We're having too much fun to answer right now. Leave a message and we'll call you back." Laughter echoed faintly in the background before the line beeped. Sarah's breath caught. Too much fun. The words twisted into her gut like a knife. Not just absent, but reveling in the choice to abandon her on the day that was supposed to mean everything. Her knees nearly buckled as she slid down against the counter, clutching the phone to her chest. Until that moment, part of her had clung to the belief that maybe circumstances had gone wrong. Maybe something had gotten in the way. But this was confirmation that they hadn't simply failed her. They had plotted this. They had chosen cruelty. Her entire life of small slights and deep wounds suddenly clicked into focus, and she realized the truth she had been too loyal to face. It had never been about her not being enough. It had always been about them, their envy, their bitterness, their twisted need to keep her small. The realization cut away the last threads of her old desperation. She had spent years twisting herself into knots, sacrificing dreams, swallowing pain, all to earn a love they had no intention of giving. Tonight, on the most important day of her life, they had shown her their true selves without disguise. For the first time, she stopped asking what was wrong with her and began to see what was broken in them. A calm, unlike anything she had felt before, began to rise in her chest. She pushed herself to her feet, gripping the counter for balance, and leaned close to the mirror. Her face was streaked and tired, but beneath the mess of tears and makeup was something steady, something fierce. She reached for tissues, wiping away the black lines, dabbing carefully until her reflection steadied. With deliberate movements, she reapplied lipstick, smoothed her hair, and adjusted her veil. Each small act was a declaration they would not steal this from her. She stood taller, shoulders squared, her chin lifting. The gown no longer felt like a costume, but armor. Not because they had blessed it with their approval, but because she had chosen to wear it despite their betrayal. They had tried to humiliate her, to crush her spirit, to leave her broken. Instead, they had revealed their weakness and forced her to discover her strength. Sarah placed her phone back into her clutch this time, not with hope, but with finality. She turned once more to her reflection, meeting her own eyes. Her voice was low, steady, every word carrying the weight of transformation. "You wanted to break me. You have no idea what you just created." When Sarah left the bathroom, her veil adjusted, and her eyes clear. The world outside had shifted. The church still hummed with music, flowers still bloomed against the altar, but the empty chairs in the front row waited like a wound. She braced herself for the sight, her chin lifted, when David's father suddenly appeared at her side. He extended his arm with quiet dignity, his eyes kind but firm. "Shall we?" he asked, and though her heart clenched at what was missing, she nodded, slipping her hand into the crook of his arm. The music swelled as they began the walk, and with each step, Sarah felt the weight of absence soften, replaced by something sturdier, something chosen. The guests sensed it too. Instead of pity, their faces shone with solidarity. They clapped louder than custom dictated, some standing early, their support rising like a shield around her. When David's father handed her to his son, a few in the pews even called out encouragements, as though determined to drown out the silence of the family section. Sarah's heart bruised, though it was swelled with gratitude. This love, unexpected and unscripted, filled the space where blood had abandoned her. The ceremony unfolded with warmth. Maria stood beside Sarah, her smile steady, her hand squeezing at just the right moments. When the minister invited her to speak, Maria's voice carried a weight that silenced the room. She spoke not only of friendship, but of family, the kind that shows up, that stays, that holds fast when storms come. Blood may bind us, she said, but it's love and loyalty that make us family. The words rippled through the guests, drawing nods, moist eyes, and knowing murmurs from those who had lived their own versions of such truth. Sarah's throat tightened, but for once it was not with sorrow. Then came the vows. David's voice did not tremble as he promised her safety, kindness, and a life free of cruelty. His hand enveloped hers, steady as stone, his gaze fierce in its tenderness. When her turn came, Sarah's voice wavered, but held. She thanked him for his unwavering love, then turned slightly to the crowd, her words carrying further than intended. And to those who showed up when it mattered, she said, "You will always have my gratitude. You proved that love is not about obligation, but choice." Applause broke out, untraditional, but undeniable. In that moment, Sarah felt the bonds of chosen family tighten around her, stronger than the fragile ties that had snapped. The reception carried that same spirit. What could have been a hollow evening bloomed into something alive. Guests improvised toasts that spoke of resilience and hope. Friends clinked glasses with extra vigor, eager to replace her loss with laughter. Even the dance floor felt different, protective circles forming around Sarah and David, as though everyone present had decided they would not let the day be marred by cruelty. Each cheer, each embrace reminded Sarah she was not alone, that abandonment had failed to define her story. Yet beneath her practiced composure, a new current stirred. As she smiled for photos and thanked guests for their presence, her mind turned sharp. Her family had thought they could erase her joy, diminish her worth, but instead they had revealed themselves. She began to picture ways to make them see what they had cast aside, to ensure that the world would not only know her pain, but also her triumph. She would not simply survive this, she would make them regret it. As the evening wound into its most tender moment, Sarah and David took to the floor for their first dance. The music swelled softly, and the guests gathered around the glow of candles, casting warm halos. David pulled her close, his voice low against her ear. "You're incredible," he whispered, his tone filled with awe. She rested her head against his shoulder for a moment, letting the comfort steady her. Then she lifted her chin, her eyes sharp despite the smile on her lips. Leaning in, she whispered, her voice carrying steel. "I want them to know exactly what they missed." David's step faltered, slightly startled by the edge in her tone. He looked down at her, searching her expression, but her smile held firm, softer on the surface, sharper underneath. It was a smile he had never seen before. The night after the wedding, as the last guests drifted away, and the glow of candlelight faded into silence, Sarah sat alone with her phone. The day had ended without the faces she once thought essential, but the strength she had found in the arms of David, Maria, and the friends who had shown up still lingered like a quiet hum inside her. She thought of the whispers during the ceremony, of the empty seats that had shouted louder than any words, and she felt a pull deep in her chest. For years her family had told her story for her, the overlooked daughter, the second best, the one never quite enough. Now she decided it was her turn to hold the pen. She opened her photo gallery, scrolling past the raw shots the photographer had taken before he vanished, and chose her own images, the ones captured by guests, by Maria, by David's father. Smiles filled those pictures, not flawless, but genuine. Maria lifting her glass in a toast, David's hand wrapped tightly around hers, the first kiss under the arch of roses. She uploaded them one by one, pairing each with carefully chosen words. "A day I will never forget, surrounded by the people who truly matter," she wrote beneath the first. Under the next, "When love shows up, that's all you need." Then came the calculated edge. She posted a series highlighting David no longer hiding his accomplishments as he always preferred. "My partner in life," and in every victory she captioned beneath a photo of him laughing with guests. The next image showed him in a quiet moment adjusting her veil. The words beneath read, "A man who builds more than love, he builds legacies." With each post, she nudged the truth closer, guiding her audience toward the revelation. The final post was the one she knew would ignite everything. She uploaded a professional headshot of David, one she had saved for their future business profiles, and paired it with a screenshot from a press release. "So proud of my husband, whose company just renewed multi-million-dollar government contracts and secured 2 new tech patents shaping the future of cybersecurity. To think they called him ordinary." She pressed post, her fingers steady, her heart steady too. Almost immediately the responses poured in. Friends commented with congratulations, colleagues with admiration. But what caught fire were the hashtags Sarah had sprinkled with care, #chose wisely, family, optional, #blessed with. Real love. The phrases spread beyond her circle, catching in the feeds of strangers who recognized themselves in her story. Women shared their own tales of being dismissed, abandoned, or underestimated, tying their pain to hers with each repost. Within hours, the phrase "abandoned bride" was trending locally, then regionally. By morning, a small news outlet had picked it up. "Local woman celebrates wedding." Despite family no-show, the headline read, pairing Sarah's radiant smile with the subtext of betrayal. Other stations followed, each story amplifying the same narrative: a woman cast aside by her family who rose above it, not only loved but married to a man whose success her family had ignored. Comment sections brimmed with outrage, empathy, and admiration. Strangers wrote things like, "This is what resilience looks like, and her family's loss is the world's gain." While Sarah and David sipped coffee in the quiet of their kitchen, her family's phones were lighting up miles away. Cousins demanded explanations, aunts left voicemails dripping with disapproval, and old neighbors sent pointed texts. "Why weren't you there? How could you embarrass her like this? Do you know what people are saying?" The story that her family had so carefully tried to script, the one where Sarah was invisible, small, unworthy, was slipping from their grasp, rewritten for everyone to see. Sarah's own phone buzzed nonstop, but this time it wasn't silence that answered her. It was power. For the first time in her life, she wasn't waiting on their approval or their excuses. She had taken the wound they gave her and turned it into something undeniable, something they couldn't spin away or hide from. She was no longer the victim of their judgment. She was the author of their humiliation. As night fell again, the inevitable happened. The family group chat that had been so empty in the days leading up to the wedding erupted with a flood of messages. "Why didn't you tell us he was wealthy?" One read the words screaming from the screen. Another followed quickly. "We had no idea. If you'd just said something." Sarah let the phone buzz and hum with their frantic energy before finally typing her answer. Her fingers did not shake. Her smile was sharp as she pressed send. "You never asked. Too busy judging." The family chat had erupted in fury the night before, but by morning it was something altogether different. Panic. Sarah could almost feel it pulsing through the silence of her phone, the desperate energy of people realizing too late the depth of the mistake they had made. While she sipped her coffee at the kitchen table beside David, her parents were scrambling across the Pacific, cutting short the Hawaiian vacation they had once flaunted. Flight confirmations buzzed across their inboxes as they booked emergency tickets home, not out of guilt, but out of fear. Friends they had bragged to for years were suddenly calling, demanding explanations. Neighbors they had once impressed with tales of family perfection were whispering in grocery store aisles. Their grand facade was collapsing, and they were desperate to get ahead of the wreckage. Michelle's approach came first. Her social media, once filled with images of palm trees and laughter, quietly shifted. She began liking every photo Sarah had ever posted, even ones from years ago that she had ignored when they first appeared. Old graduation pictures, work anniversaries, holiday dinners, each lit up with Michelle's sudden approval, as though retroactive digital affection might erase the silence that had wounded most deeply. To anyone watching, it might have seemed like sisterly love. To Sarah, it was a performance, one that reeked of opportunism. Her father, ever more brazen, took his efforts further. A LinkedIn request popped up on David's phone that morning, accompanied by a message filled with hollow cheer. "Excited to see where your ventures are headed? Let's connect professionally." David raised an eyebrow, handing the screen to Sarah without a word. They both knew what it meant. This wasn't a man reaching out to his daughter's husband with genuine interest. It was a man who had realized too late that the quiet tech consultant he dismissed was a force far greater than he imagined. The pattern was undeniable. Every call, every text, every half-hearted apology that trickled in was not about Sarah. Not one mention of the empty seats at the church. The silence that had crushed her in the days leading up to the wedding, the mocking photos from Hawaii. Instead, each message circled the same obsession: David's wealth, the contracts, the patents, the sudden visibility of Sarah's marriage. They wanted proximity to power, not reconciliation with the daughter they had discarded. Their shame was not rooted in love, but in exposure. Meanwhile, the backlash grew louder. Cousins rang Sarah in disbelief, demanding to know why they hadn't been told the truth. An aunt left a voicemail dripping with indignation. How could they lie like that? We thought something terrible had happened, and instead they were sipping cocktails by a pool. Family friends turned icy, muttering to each other about betrayal gossip thick in church hallways and over backyard fences. The story had taken on a life of its own, and it painted Sarah's family in strokes they couldn't wash away. The most pathetic attempt came when Sarah's mother called Maria. Her voice carefully measured, trying to plant a new narrative. "We've always supported Sarah." She insisted, layering her tone with false sweetness. "This is just a misunderstanding." But Maria, fiercely loyal, relayed every word to Sarah, her laughter sharp. "They really think they can rewrite history," she said. And indeed, the family began parroting the same lines wherever they could, that they had always believed in Sarah, that they had only missed the wedding because of a confusing mix-up, that their silence had been misinterpreted. But lies once exposed to daylight cannot be stitched back together. The world had already seen too much. Sarah's new power lay not in confrontation, but in indifference. For the first time, she had no desire to plead, to explain, to fix. She let the calls go unanswered, the texts pile up unacknowledged. Their desperation grew with each hour of silence. They wanted her to extend a lifeline, to give them a chance to crawl back into the narrative they had abandoned. She refused. Instead, she poured her attention into David, into Maria, into the circle of people who had stood by her when it mattered. That evening, as her phone buzzed once again with the cacophony of pleas, Sarah finally opened the family chat. Lines of frantic messages scrolled upward, excuses, half apologies, demands for clarification. At the bottom waited her mother's latest attempt. "Please answer us. Let's talk about this." Sarah's lips curved into a smile, sharp and sure. Her fingers danced across the keys, her response short and cutting. "New phone, who dis?" she typed. Then, without hesitation, she blocked every single one of them. Sarah sat at her desk the next morning, her phone buzzing with unanswered messages from relatives she had long since muted. The house was quiet, except for the soft hum of David working in the next room, but her mind was restless. She had blocked her parents and Michelle after their desperate pleas. Yet the nagging feeling that something deeper had been stolen from her refused to quiet down. The images of them laughing in Hawaii while she walked down the aisle without family still cut like a blade. But now, there was an itch behind the anger, something telling her she hadn't seen the whole picture. So she opened her laptop, signed into her company's financial portal, and began to comb through the records she normally left to her accountant. At first, everything looked normal. event budgets, payroll, vendor invoices. But then her eyes landed on a charge that made her stomach turn. The exact Hawaiian resort from the mocking selfies was listed under her corporate card billed just days before her wedding. The charge had cleared without her approval. She leaned closer, her pulse quickening, and clicked through to find not only one but several expenses tied to that same account authorized with her signature. Only it wasn't her signature at all. The scrawl was crude, clumsy, almost cartoonish in its attempt to mimic her name. Sarah's throat tightened as she scrolled further, discovering a paper trail stretching back years, thousands here, thousands there, always labeled family emergency. The total ballooned, quickly climbing past $50,000. Her hands shook as she read line after line a so-called emergency loan that lined up with Michelle's house down payment, a string of medical reimbursements that matched the timing of her parents' Mediterranean cruise, and now the Hawaiian getaway that had turned her wedding day into a public humiliation. The betrayal wasn't only emotional, it had been financial, calculated, and parasitic. Sarah clicked open her email archives, searching for connections she might have missed, and there it was, a thread between her mother and Michelle, casually discussing her money like it was community property. One message read, "Don't worry, I'll handle Sarah's card. She never checks. We'll frame it as an emergency if she asks." Another, more brazen, said, "Just make sure she doesn't catch wind of this before the wedding. It'll ruin everything." Her breath hitched. Ruin everything. As though the only thing at stake was their pleasure, their vacations, their entitlement to the success she had bled for. Sarah printed the emails, laid them across her desk, and stared at them with mounting fury. Every sleepless night building her agency, every contract negotiated, every sacrifice of her own comfort to get ahead, it had been siphoned off without her knowledge, twisted into a lifeline for the very people who sneered at her worth. When David stepped into the room, she looked up at him with wild eyes. "They've been stealing from me for years," she whispered. He came closer, scanning the papers, and his jaw tightened. "This isn't family borrowing," he said firmly. "This is fraud." The word rang in her ears, heavy and undeniable. Fraud. Not a misunderstanding, not an accident, not a family squabble. A crime. Later that afternoon, she sat across from a polished attorney in a downtown office, the pile of documents stacked neatly on the mahogany desk between them. The lawyer, a woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, adjusted her glasses as she reviewed the evidence. "The signatures alone are damning," she said. "But these emails, they show intent. This isn't just mishandling funds, it's premeditated fraud. If we take this to court, your mother and sister could both face prosecution. Restitution is likely. Prison time is possible." Sarah swallowed hard, her mind flickering between outrage and a sickening kind of grief. The little girl inside her still wanted to believe her family cared, still wanted to think the theft was some kind of mistake. But the adult woman staring at the evidence saw the truth with brutal clarity. They had built their comfort on her back, mocked her when she caught a moment of happiness, and laughed in her face while draining her accounts. The lawyer leaned forward, her expression sharp. "Do you want to press charges for fraud?" Sarah looked down at the stack of stolen years, the vacations, the house, the casual cruelty of emails that treated her success as their entitlement. Her voice was steady, colder than she ever thought it could be. "I want to press everything." The decision to press everything had left Sarah with a clarity she had never known before. That night she sat across from David at their dining table, papers and laptops spread between them, the weight of betrayal giving way to something steadier resolve. "They thought they could take everything from me," she said quietly. "But they're about to see I can turn even their cruelty into something powerful." David reached for her hand and nodded. It was the beginning of a transformation, not just for Sarah, but for countless others who carried invisible scars like hers. Within weeks, Sarah and David announced the launch of a new nonprofit, Bridges Over Blood. The name carried her story inside it, an acknowledgement that family by blood had failed her. But bridges of compassion could be built stronger than genetics. The charity's mission was clear and sharp to support emotionally abandoned children and adults, providing scholarships, housing assistance, therapy resources, and mentorship for those who, like Sarah, had been cast aside by the people meant to protect them. They didn't just quietly open the doors, they staged a media blitz. A carefully crafted press release, professional portraits of Sarah in a commanding but approachable pose, and a launch event that blended her marketing expertise with David's strategic connections. She didn't just start a charity, she made it impossible to ignore. When Sarah appeared on her first local TV interview, she spoke not with bitterness, but with conviction. She described the pain of watching her family laugh on a beach while she stood at the altar alone. She told the audience how abandonment can break a person in ways people don't see, and how silence and favoritism can destroy more than words ever could. Yet she didn't stop there. She turned her personal wound into a universal call. "I know I'm not alone," she said into the camera, her voice steady, her eyes unwavering. "There are children sitting at dinner tables right now wondering why they're never enough. There are women being told they're too serious, too ambitious, too unlovable. I'm here to tell them they are not broken. They are survivors." The response was immediate. Viewers flooded the station with messages of gratitude. Women in their 50s and 60s wrote to Sarah confessing how her words had cracked open secrets they had carried for decades. Younger women shared posts about her courage, calling her the voice they never had. Social media lit up with hashtags linked to her foundation, merging her story with countless others. What began as a local human interest piece became a national conversation. Soon Sarah's face appeared on morning shows, news segments, and podcasts. Each time she carried herself with calm authority, her words never exaggerated her tone, never vindictive. That poise made her message all the more devastating for her family. While she became a beacon of resilience, her mother's colleagues whispered about the scandal. Her father's old golf partners withdrew invitations. Michelle's social circle evaporated, leaving her exposed. The more Sarah rose, the further they sank, trapped in the shadow of the truth they had created. The horror for them was not just in Sarah's success, but in their irrelevance. Neighbors who once praised her mother's cooking now crossed the street to avoid awkward encounters. Old family friends reached out to Sarah, privately apologizing for not recognizing the cruelty sooner. The people who had once excused their favoritism now turned on them. Sarah didn't need to lift a finger. Her story, once dismissed, had grown legs and marched across the country. Through it all, Sarah realized something important. This was no longer about proving herself to the people who had never cared. It was about showing others what was possible. She recognized that her story carried power beyond her personal healing. It could reshape how society understood emotional neglect, favoritism, and family betrayal. She had the ability to take the shame they had placed on her shoulders and turn it into a weapon for change. Her days, once filled with chasing her family's scraps of approval, were now consumed with meaningful work. Meetings with lawmakers who wanted to understand inheritance fraud, panels discussing the hidden epidemic of adult children abandoned at milestones, partnerships with shelters, universities and therapists who saw in Sarah a leader who could bridge gaps no one else was willing to acknowledge. For the first time, Sarah wasn't reacting, she was leading. She wasn't chasing love, she was creating it for others who had none. At home, David often marveled at the woman unfolding before him. "You're not just surviving anymore," he told her one evening as they looked over the foundation's growing donor list. "You're building something they could never take away." Sarah smiled, feeling the truth settle into her bones. She was no longer the desperate daughter standing outside her parents' door hoping to be let in. She was a woman with her own door, her own house, her own family, inviting in those who knew how to stay. Her transformation was undeniable, and the world was watching. The same newspapers that once printed engagement announcements of people her family admired now ran features about her courage. Reporters used words like trailblazer, advocate, survivor. What her family had tried to turn into her deepest humiliation had become the foundation of her public triumph. It all built to a pivotal interview on national television. Sarah sat under the studio lights, Her hands folded, her expression calm but unflinching as the interviewer recapped her journey. Millions of viewers leaned closer to their screens as the interviewer asked the final question. "You've come so far. You've turned unimaginable pain into purpose. But what's next for you?" Sarah's eyes flashed with determination. She leaned in slightly, her voice low and firm, every syllable measured like a vow. "Justice," she said, "and it's going to be very public." The interview lights had barely dimmed when Sarah felt a pull inside her that had nothing to do with television or charities. The applause, the messages, the national headlines, those had fed her new identity. But something deeper still nagged at her, something that no amount of public recognition could silence. Why had she always felt like a stranger in her own family? Why had every kindness she offered been twisted, every success diminished? The cruelty was deliberate. Yes, but it felt rooted in something older, something festering, long before she was old enough to disappoint anyone. She had spent decades blaming herself, then months uncovering financial theft. Now, for the first time, she wondered if there was an even darker truth that explained her father's coldness and her mother's sharp contempt. Sarah hired a private investigator she had met during the early stages of her legal battles. The woman was discreet, thorough, and accustomed to uncovering family secrets most people would rather keep buried. Sarah asked her to look into anything that could explain the peculiar way her father had always treated her. Within days, the investigator called back with something unusual. "There are discrepancies in your family's medical records," she explained. "Your blood type doesn't match the combination of your parents. It's not possible, at least not genetically." Sarah felt the air leave her lungs. She authorized a full DNA test, something she had never dared to consider before. When the results came back, they confirmed what she had long suspected, but never had the words to articulate she was not her father's biological daughter. The report was clinical, emotionless, but its implications were seismic. Her mother, back in 1991, had carried on an affair with a traveling businessman who had passed through town for a series of conferences. That affair had produced Sarah. The man had since died, leaving behind a tidy fortune and a reputation for discipline, intelligence, and relentless drive, the very qualities Sarah had been mocked for by the family who now seemed even less hers than ever. The investigator dug further, piecing together evidence from old hotel bills, letters, and one surviving friend of the businessman who confirmed what Sarah already knew in her gut. The resemblance was unmistakable. Sarah's work ethic, her sharp mind, her refusal to play small, these weren't traits her father had ignored. They were reminders of betrayal he had never forgiven her mother for. And rather than confront his wife, he had punished Sarah every day of her life for a crime she never committed. Suddenly, everything made sense. The favoritism toward Michelle wasn't just about charm. It was about Michelle being safe, the child who belonged to him. Sarah had been his living reminder of humiliation, a walking accusation. Every time she outperformed, every time she stood tall, she reminded him of the man who had outshone him in his own marriage. The more she succeeded, the deeper the shame he felt, and the harsher the punishment he delivered. Then came the shock that turned revelation into power. The businessman who had unknowingly fathered her had passed away the previous year. In his will, he acknowledged her existence, leaving her $750,000 money earmarked for her alone, completely outside the reach of the family who had stolen so much already. It was validation written in legal ink. She was wanted, she was recognized, she was worthy, and her worth had nothing to do with the approval she had chased all her life. Sarah sat at her desk, staring at the DNA results, her hands trembling but her heart steadier than it had ever been. The decades of dismissal, the constant refrain of disappointment, it had never been about her failures. It had been about their guilt. She was not their shameful daughter. She was their living, breathing conscience, the evidence of a betrayal they had tried to bury under cruelty. Slowly, almost reverently, she whispered into the empty room, "I was never your disappointment. I was your guilty conscience walking around in human form." The truth of Sarah's DNA had cracked open a door she could never close again. For the first time in her life, she saw her family not as a mystery to solve, but as a pattern of deception to unravel. And once she had taken the first step, the pieces kept falling into place. The private investigator who had uncovered the affair didn't stop there. One afternoon, she handed Sarah a folder thick with aging documents and a voice recorder wrapped in a cloth. "You should see this," she said, her tone heavy with the gravity of what she carried. Inside was a copy of her grandfather's original will, signed and notarized decades ago. Sarah had always remembered him as the one person who saw her for who she was: serious, ambitious, independent. The will confirmed it. In neat legal phrasing, it left Sarah $500,000 designated specifically to encourage her independent spirit and ability to build her own path. The words brought tears to her eyes. He had believed in her. He had tried to protect her. But she had never seen this document, not once, even when she turned 18 and should have received what was rightfully hers. The investigator explained what she had pieced together. Shortly after the will was read, Sarah's father, in collaboration with the long-trusted family lawyer, had orchestrated a quiet transfer. Through technical maneuvers and falsified paperwork, the inheritance meant for Sarah was funneled into Michelle's trust fund. By the time Sarah had graduated high school, that money had already been used to pay Michelle's tuition, her car, and later the down payment on her first home. Sarah had been told there was nothing set aside for her, and like always, she accepted it, too busy surviving the dismissals to question the lies. Her grandfather must have suspected it might happen, because tucked alongside the will was something even more damning: recordings. Sarah pressed play, and her grandfather's voice filled the room. The years in his tone were familiar, comforting, but the words were sharp. "My son favors Michelle unfairly. He cannot see Sarah's worth. I fear when I am gone he will find ways to deny her what is hers. If he steals from Sarah, he proves himself unworthy of the family name." The recording clicked off, then resumed on another file. "I love Michelle. But Sarah has the spirit I once had. She will make something of herself if she's allowed. If my son robs her of that, then shame on him." Sarah closed her eyes, tears sliding down her cheeks, not of weakness but of recognition. Her grandfather had seen her. He had known the truth even as everyone else minimized her. He had predicted the theft, and it had happened exactly as he feared. The evidence was airtight, and with her lawyer's help, Sarah initiated the process that would rip the last veneer of respectability from her parents. The investigation moved swiftly. Bank accounts were frozen as the inheritance fraud case opened. Her father, once so smug at the country club, now faced the prospect of criminal charges. His retirement fund was locked, leaving her mother's modest teaching salary as their only legitimate income. The house payments loomed. Creditors called. The once comfortable life they had built on deception was crumbling piece by piece. Sarah, however, did not rush to expose them publicly. She waited. She let the panic build. Weeks passed while her parents grew more desperate, confused why their bank cards were declined and why Michelle's trust fund was suddenly under scrutiny. Sarah bided her time, letting them sweat, letting the weight of the law press down before she made her move. She wanted them to understand what it felt like to live under someone else's power, to have no control, to feel the ground shifting beneath them. Finally, she called for a meeting. They came defensive and nervous, expecting perhaps a reconciliation. Instead, Sarah pulled out the voice recorder and placed it gently on the table. "There's something you should hear," she said. Her father's face drained of color the moment his own father's voice began to play, echoing through the room like a ghost dragging chains. The words were impossible to argue with, spoken years before the theft, predicting exactly what had happened. Her father's hands shook as the recording ended. His lips parted, but no words came. The silence was heavier than any accusation Sarah could have made herself. She leaned back, her gaze steady, no longer the pleading daughter, but the woman in command of truth. "You always said I was a disappointment," she said evenly, "but it looks like you were the one who disappointed him." She pressed play on the final recording. Her grandfather's voice, steady and damning, filled the room one last time. "If my son steals from Sarah, he's proven he's not worthy of the family name." Sarah watched her father's face turn ashen. The silence that followed her grandfather's recording had left Sarah's father pale and broken. But for Sarah, it was not the end. She knew there was another layer still buried beneath decades of dysfunction, and she was ready to peel it back. When her investigator slid another folder across the table, Sarah braced herself. This time, the contents were not about theft or hidden money, but about the person who had shaped her childhood as much as her parents had her sister Michelle. Inside were leaked medical records from Michelle's adolescence records Sarah had never known existed. They revealed diagnoses that had been quietly kept from the outside world: borderline personality disorder and strong narcissistic tendencies, identified as early as 16. Therapists had recommended intensive treatment, but it was never pursued. Instead, her parents had folded the records away, labeling Michelle sensitive, and insisting she just needed extra attention. In their effort to protect the family's image, they had sacrificed Sarah's well-being, feeding Michelle's illness with endless appeasement. As Sarah sifted through the documents, her mind began to connect threads from her past that suddenly made chilling sense. Michelle's sabotage hadn't been occasional or accidental, it had been systematic. In high school, Sarah's first boyfriend had inexplicably broken up with her after Michelle hinted that Sarah wasn't really interested. Years later, another relationship ended after Sarah's partner admitted Michelle had told him Sarah was too ambitious to ever settle down. At the time, Sarah thought they were coincidences, but now she saw the deliberate pattern. Michelle's manipulations, lies, and whispered half-truths had followed her like shadows designed to isolate her and keep her beneath her sister's grasp. The pattern extended into adulthood. Michelle had spread rumors about Sarah's work habits, planting seeds of doubt among extended family and even mutual acquaintances. Whenever Sarah built something meaningful, Michelle would appear with a quiet word, a subtle undermining, until Sarah was left wondering if she had imagined the support she thought she'd earned. Her parents, far from correcting Michelle, had enabled her at every turn. "She just gets jealous," her mother would say, or "Michelle needs more attention right now." Their blind indulgence had allowed Michelle's illness to metastasize into cruelty. But perhaps the most unsettling revelation wasn't what Michelle had taken from Sarah, it was what she had tried to become. Alongside the records were notes from teachers and counselors describing how Michelle often mimicked Sarah's behaviors, adopting her hobbies, copying her study habits, even attempting to model her writing style. The investigator had traced old journals and emails that showed Michelle studying Sarah's successes like a blueprint, all while working behind the scenes to undermine them. It wasn't just competition. It was identity theft driven by pathological envy. Michelle hadn't wanted Sarah to fail. She wanted Sarah's life for herself. And the tragedy was that Michelle had passed this sickness down. Sarah had seen the signs in Michelle's children, the way her nephew apologized constantly for things that weren't his fault, the way her niece had started using phrases far beyond her years like, "I have to keep mommy calm." They were being molded not as children, but as caretakers for their mother's instability. Parentification had stolen their innocence just as Michelle's unchecked behavior had stolen so much from Sarah. The cycle was repeating itself in the next generation, fueled by the same denial and excuses Sarah had grown up with. Sarah sat back and let the weight of it all settle. It would have been easy to let rage consume her, to see Michelle as nothing but the villain in her story. But staring at the records, Sarah felt something sharper and more complicated than hatred. Michelle had been sick for decades, untreated and indulged, and Sarah had been the casualty of her parents' cowardice. The betrayal was real, but so was the brokenness. Sarah could weaponize this truth, yes, but she also understood Michelle needed more than punishment. She needed help, even if she was too far gone to accept it. Still, empathy didn't mean weakness. Sarah knew how to use this information strategically. At the next public event where her family tried to play the part of respectable pillars of the community, she quietly released excerpts of Michelle's history to key people in their social circle. It wasn't the cruel details, it was enough to reveal the truth behind years of Sarah's bad luck. The whispers shifted. The narrative changed. Suddenly, Michelle was not the golden child, but the troubled saboteur, her envy and instability laid bare for the world to see. the moment of reckoning came faster than Sarah expected. At a charity luncheon, Michelle, cornered by questions and whispers she couldn't deflect, broke down in front of the very crowd she once charmed with ease. Her voice cracked, her hands trembling as she turned toward Sarah, her mask shattered. "I didn't want to hurt you," she sobbed, her words carrying across the stunned room. "I wanted to be you, but you were always better at being yourself than I was." The revelations about Michelle had barely settled when Sarah turned her attention to the other cornerstone of her family's structure, her mother. For most of her life, the woman had been held up as a paragon in their small community, a beloved schoolteacher admired for her commitment to fairness and moral instruction. Parents trusted her students, adored her, and neighbors held her in esteem. But Sarah had always known a darker truth, one that was whispered in their home rather than proclaimed in classrooms. Her mother's lessons about kindness and equality never applied behind closed doors. While the world saw a patient mentor, Sarah knew the biting remarks, the cold comparisons, and the systematic diminishment of her own worth that were woven into her upbringing. It was only when Sarah finally began to dig that she uncovered proof powerful enough to shatter the carefully constructed facade her mother had maintained for decades. The first piece of evidence came almost accidentally. While reviewing emails tied to the financial investigation that had already uncovered her father's theft, Sarah stumbled upon private correspondence between her mother and colleagues. What she found confirmed everything she had endured, but never been able to prove. In those emails, her mother discussed strategies for hardening girls in her classes, often singling out those she deemed too emotional or not disciplined enough. The language was chillingly similar to the words Sarah had grown up hearing, claims that she needed to be toughened up, that she wasn't cut out for leadership, that her talents were better used in service of others. Even more damning were notes where her mother showed clear bias, favoring male students for opportunities while criticizing female ones as too dramatic or unstable. Sarah hesitated before making the next move, but she knew hesitation had never protected her before. Quietly, she released the documents to a trusted journalist who specialized in education scandals. The story broke quickly. At first, the community resisted believing that their beloved teacher could harbor such prejudice. But the words were there in black and white, undeniable and irrefutable. Parents who had once spoken glowingly of her began to revisit memories. Some recalled how their daughters had been discouraged from advanced placement classes while their sons were praised. Others remembered the subtle favoritism but had dismissed it at the time as imagination. Now it all seemed to fit into a pattern. The school district had no choice but to launch an official investigation. A task force combed through years of her teaching records, speaking to former students who came forward with complaints long buried under shame or fear of retribution. The findings painted a damning portrait favoritism that spanned decades, punishments that disproportionately targeted certain students, and a culture of intimidation that silenced those who questioned her authority. For Sarah, watching the facade crumble was surreal. Her mother had always carried herself as the righteous one, the family's moral compass, the respected community leader. But beneath the polished exterior was someone who had inflicted harm not only on her own daughter but on countless others who had trusted her guidance. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah. The very values her mother had preached so loudly in public had been violated in practice again and again. As the district's findings became public, the dominoes began to fall. Families who had once attended school events with pride began expressing outrage. Former students, many now adults with children of their own, shared stories on social media about the subtle ways they had been diminished or excluded. A chorus of voices grew, each one validating what Sarah had felt for years. This wasn't just about one mother's cruelty within her home. It was about an educator who had betrayed her responsibility to the children she was supposed to nurture. The fallout was swift. The school board suspended her mother pending further investigation, a move that shocked the town. For a woman who had built her entire identity around her professional reputation, it was a devastating blow. Her teaching license was placed under review, and whispers of permanent revocation circulated through the education department. The The proud matriarch who had spent years proclaiming her own virtue now found herself at the center of scandal, her carefully curated reputation unraveling thread by thread. What struck Sarah most was not just the exposure itself, but the realization of how many people had known something was wrong and had chosen silence. Parents had excused her mother's behavior because of her status. Administrators had looked the other way to avoid conflict, and even Sarah herself had once convinced herself that maybe she was simply too sensitive. Now, as the truth was dragged into the light, it became clear how complicity had enabled her mother's reign for so long. In the community that had once celebrated her mother as a model of integrity, a new narrative began to form. Conversations at grocery stores and church gatherings shifted from admiration to condemnation. Neighbors who once praised her stopped making eye contact. Parents who had entrusted their children to her classroom demanded answers, and others began asking themselves how they could have missed the signs. It wasn't just Sarah's mother who fell under scrutiny, it was everyone who had applauded her without question, everyone who had ignored the cracks in the story because it was easier to believe in the illusion. Sarah watched it all unfold with a strange mixture of vindication and sorrow. She had not set out to destroy her mother's career for sport. She had simply revealed what had been hidden for too long. But as she saw her mother's name plastered across local headlines, as she heard the sharp tone in the voices of parents demanding justice, she realized that this reckoning had been inevitable. A life built on a false image could only withstand so much before crumbling under its own weight. The most poignant moment came late one evening when Sarah received a voicemail from her mother's colleague, the school board president. His voice was firm, almost regretful, as he explained the board's decision. He said plainly what Sarah had longed to hear: someone else acknowledge the career was over, the license would be revoked, and every disciplinary action her mother had ever recommended would be re-examined in light of the bias now exposed. School board president calls, "Your teaching career is over. We're also reviewing every disciplinary action you've ever recommended." The unraveling of her mother's reputation had sent shockwaves through their community, but Sarah knew the downfall of her father required something more precise, more cutting. His pride had always rested on his career. He was the man who looked down on her accomplishments, dismissing her boutique agency as small potatoes while boasting about his decades in corporate management. At family dinners, he often mocked her strategies, saying things like, "Marketing is fluff. Real money comes from industries that actually build things." It was in that arrogance, that brittle confidence in his own position, that Sarah saw the perfect place to strike. And David, with his quiet but growing tech empire, gave her the weapon she needed. For months, David had been expanding his cybersecurity firm. What began as a consulting outfit had turned into a company with significant government contracts and an acquisition strategy targeting vulnerable corporations. One of those companies happened to be her father's. It wasn't a coincidence. Through a chain of shell corporations and carefully concealed buyouts, David quietly arranged for controlling interest in the firm her father had bragged about for years. Sarah never needed to lift a finger. She only had to watch the pieces fall into place. When the buyout was finalized, her father was blindsided. The announcement came not as a courtesy, but through a stiff email delivered to all employees. Effective, immediately restructuring measures will be put in place under new ownership. His pride turned to panic as rumors spread that layoffs were imminent. For a man who had built his identity around his role at the company, the shock of realizing he no longer had control was devastating. Worse, the restructuring plan seemed tailor-made to humiliate him. Entire departments were reorganized, but his division was dissolved completely. He wasn't offered a dignified retirement package, only a forced early retirement with minimal pension benefits. Colleagues who had once envied his position now whispered about the scandal surrounding his family, connecting the dots between Sarah's very public story and the company's quiet takeover. At lunch tables and water coolers, they exchanged knowing looks. One coworker who had known Sarah since high school muttered, "Funny how karma works, huh? He always said she'd never amount to anything." The irony was unbearable. The daughter he had dismissed now stood behind the power that dismantled his professional identity. The humiliation didn't end at the office. At home, the weight of the lost income hit hard. With assets already frozen from the inheritance investigation, the family's financial cushion evaporated. Bills piled up, mortgage notices grew more urgent, and the man who once lorded over his family with the security of his paycheck now found himself searching job boards late at night. The sight of him hunched over a laptop applying for part-time retail jobs and entry-level management positions would have been unimaginable months earlier. His pride shattered, he tried to hide the desperation. But Sarah knew. What twisted the knife deeper was the timing. The company's acquisition aligned perfectly with the fallout from her mother's scandal. As the town whispered about the teacher exposed as a fraud, they now also gossiped about the once powerful man stripped of his career. Neighbors began to avoid them not out of sympathy, but with quiet disdain. Invitations to community events stopped arriving. It was as though the entire social circle they had once valued had closed its doors. Sarah didn't take joy in their suffering the way some might expect. What she felt was colder, sharper justice. Her father had not only failed to protect her growing up, but had actively reinforced the cruelty by siding with her mother's favoritism. He had laughed when her accomplishments were diminished. He had told her more than once that Michelle needed support more because she wasn't as strong. Now it was he who was weak, forced to depend on others, stripped of the power that once made him untouchable. The final blow came quietly, delivered in the most personal way. Among the job applications her father sent out, one was for a mid-level consultant role at a firm newly acquired by David's company. He never realized until later that the interview panel would include her. The notice arrived in his inbox one morning: interview scheduled. Ms. Sarah Thompson requests to personally review your application. The moment he read those words, his hands trembled. For decades he had made her feel small, unworthy, insignificant. Now, in black and white, was the truth he couldn't escape. The daughter he had dismissed now held his fate in her hands. Father receives interview invitation. Ms. Thompson requests to personally review your application. He realizes his daughter now controls his fate. The humiliation of her father's downfall was still echoing through the community when Sarah decided the time had come to turn her attention to Michelle. Her sister had always been the golden child, shielded from consequence, adored by their parents, and placed on a pedestal in the community. Michelle's crown jewel was her marriage. She and Tom were presented as the perfect couple, the ones who made it work, the couple others looked at with admiration. They threw lavish holiday parties, hosted neighborhood barbecues, and posted glowing social media updates of family vacations. For years, Michelle wielded that image like a weapon, subtly using it to remind Sarah of what she lacked. But Sarah knew a truth Michelle didn't. The very foundation of that marriage had been built on a lie. Years earlier, when Sarah was still in her 20s, Tom had pursued her. She remembered the discomfort of his lingering stares at family gatherings, the way he sought excuses to speak to her privately, the messages that began as friendly but quickly slid into something more suggestive. She had rejected him firmly, unwilling to betray her sister or entertain the advances. He didn't stop immediately. He sent late-night texts, left voicemails that grew increasingly desperate, even confessing once in a slurred message that if he had met her before Michelle, he never would have married her sister. Sarah saved them all, disturbed by his persistence but unwilling to start a war back then. The files sat in a secure folder on her computer, a reminder of what Michelle never knew. As years passed, Tom shifted his focus toward Michelle proposing after a whirlwind romance that stunned even their closest friends. To the outside world, it looked like destiny. To Sarah, it always looked like resignation. The texts and voicemails stopped, but the bitterness never entirely disappeared. Over the years, whenever Sarah crossed paths with Tom, there was always a flicker in his eyes, a trace of something unspoken. She ignored it, burying her discomfort. Now, though, she saw in those old messages an opportunity. The timing was everything. Michelle's birthday was approaching, a day she traditionally used to flaunt her seemingly perfect life. She loved hosting elaborate dinners, receiving glowing compliments, basking in attention from family and friends. That was the day Sarah chose. She gathered every piece of evidence, archived text logs, voicemails converted into audio files, and even screenshots of Tom's early social media messages that had gone unnoticed at the time. It painted a devastating picture. Tom had wanted Sarah first, only to settle for Michelle when he couldn't have her. The timeline was damning. There were messages sent during Michelle's pregnancies, times when Tom should have been most supportive, that revealed his simmering resentment. He confided his frustrations, hinting at regrets and longing for the life he imagined with Sarah. He complained about Michelle's mood swings, mocked her family expectations, and at one point confessed outright, "You were always the one I wanted. I just made the best of what I had." Sarah understood how explosive this would be. Their social circle admired Michelle and Tom as role models. Parents pointed to them as examples of partnership. To learn that their marriage was built not on love but on compromise, and that Michelle had been second choice to her own sister, would shatter that illusion completely. The scandal would ripple through every barbecue, every community meeting, every whispered conversation in the grocery store aisle. The night before Michelle's birthday, Sarah sat in her office carefully assembling the evidence. She wasn't reckless. She knew the weight of what she was about to release. Each file was time-stamped, verified, undeniable. There would be no escape, no claim of forgery or misunderstanding. When she was done, she wrote a short message to accompany the package. It was not angry or cruel, just devastatingly precise. On Michelle's birthday morning, as she prepared to host her annual celebration, Sarah pressed send. The email landed in Michelle's inbox, her husband's inbox, and by calculated design, several close friends who had once praised Michelle's perfect marriage. Within minutes, phones lit up across the community as the evidence spread. Guests canceled their attendance to Michelle's party. Neighbors whispered. Tom's business associates distanced themselves. Michelle's devastation was immediate. Friends later described the look on her face when she opened the message. Disbelief that turned to horror as she played voicemail after voicemail of her husband pining for her sister. She tried calling Tom, but by then the damage had already spiraled beyond their walls. For years, she had believed herself the chosen one, elevated above Sarah by both her family and her marriage. Now she was forced to face the unbearable truth: she had been the consolation prize. Sarah didn't gloat. She didn't need to. The silence that followed Michelle's public collapse spoke louder than anything Sarah could have said. The community that once admired Michelle now pitied her, and the husband she clung to for validation had been exposed as faithless long before vows were exchanged. The birthday celebration that was meant to reaffirm Michelle's place as the golden child became the day her pedestal cracked beyond repair. Sarah sends the evidence with a note. "Happy birthday. Thought you should know who you really married all these years." The collapse of Michelle's carefully curated life sent ripples through the town, but Sarah knew there was a deeper engine behind the cruelty, something organized, methodical, and far more disturbing than individual spite. After Michelle's birthday revelations, the private investigator returned to Sarah with one of the most chilling pieces of evidence, yet access to a closed Facebook group that had been quietly active for years. The name alone felt like an indictment. Managing Sarah, but it was the members and the content that made Sarah's skin crawl. Over 200 people from their extended family and social circle populated the group, and the posts read like a playbook for emotional sabotage. For the first time, Sarah saw how deliberate the campaign had been. Threads cataloged her successes with snide commentary screenshots of her business announcements, annotated with mocking notes and polls that asked members to bet on which of Sarah's relationships would implode next. There were instructions on how to handle sensitive conversations, templates for gaslighting responses, and even suggested talking points for community events where they could quietly plant doubts about Sarah's character. The posts were not casual cruelty. They were coordinated, practiced, and meant to strip her of confidence over time. Reading through the archive felt like sitting in on a decades-long war room dedicated to her undoing. The recruitment process was brazen. Messages showed family members enlisting neighbors, co-workers, and even former teachers to participate. Keep the narrative tight, one post read with suggested language to use if Sarah's achievements were discussed publicly. Another message encouraged members to privately collect intel on Sarah's relationships and forward anything useful. A woman who had once been a Sunday school leader was advising others on how to sow doubt without seeming mean, offering bullet points for whisper campaigns. The group had turned social cruelty into an art form, and it had become an accepted pastime among people who saw themselves as guardians of a social order that excluded Sarah. What made the discoveries more gutting was the double life most members led in public. In community posts and church halls, they praised family unity and spoke of compassion, while in the closed group they traded photos and jokes at Sarah's expense. Members would publicly post supportive comments on Sarah's social media while privately mocking her in the group. Screenshots showed them saving her posts for later ridicule, dissecting the language of her captions to turn them into private punchlines. The cognitive dissonance was staggering, people professing love while actively participating in her degradation. Once the documents had been authenticated, Sarah's legal team began reaching out to those implicated. The fallout was swift and humiliating. Longtime friends found themselves confronted with screenshots they could not deny. Parents who had once recommended Sarah for volunteer roles were suddenly apologizing publicly as more victims from the group's past came forward. The community that had once ostracized Sarah now watched embarrassed and enraged as the truth emerged about how complicit they had been, either by action or by willful blindness. The impact was not limited to social shaming. Employers and local organizations rescinded invitations and positions held by those implicated. One woman who had been a frequent speaker at charity events found her bookings canceled when a video of her mocking Sarah resurfaced. The town association that had prided itself on supporting families issued a public statement condemning the behavior, and the Facebook group itself was removed after multiple reports. People who had once thrived on their insider status now saw their reputations crumble under the weight of their own words. Sarah did not leak the entire archive at once. She and her team curated the releases, ensuring the community saw the pattern rather than a chaotic assortment of nastiness. Each disclosure came with context timelines showing how group activities correlated with key moments in her life, examples of coordinated attempts to undermine her relationships, and testimony from people who had been recruited into the campaign only to regret their participation later. The goal was to show that this was not a series of petty acts, but an organized effort that spanned decades, designed to destroy a single person's standing in her community. As details spread, something unexpected happened. Others began to speak. Women who had felt isolated by their own family dynamics reached out to Sarah, sharing stories of coordinated smear campaigns of relatives who rallied friends to keep them small. The narrative shifted from one woman's betrayal to a broader conversation about how communities can normalize cruelty when it masquerades as tradition or protection. Local counselors and social workers noted a surge in calls from adults seeking support after recognizing similar patterns in their own families. Sarah's experience had become a catalyst for people to confront their own histories. The town's reaction ranged from outrage to disbelief. Some defended themselves, claiming context had been lost, while others admitted shame and asked how they could make amends. The media interest intensified as the story proved to be more than gossip. It was a social study of how collective cruelty is manufactured and sustained. Reporters dug through archives, uncovered more examples of coordinated shaming in other neighborhoods, and framed Sarah's case as emblematic of a wider cultural problem. The private group that had once operated in the shadows was now public record, and the members who had once felt safe behind closed doors faced consequences in both their public and private lives. When a local news anchor read aloud selections from the group's posts during a primetime segment, the town seemed to hold its breath. The camera lingered on screenshots showing smug comments, organized polls, and planning notes. Viewers heard the unmistakable pattern emerge: a community that had turned a woman's life into a long-running spectacle. The anchor's voice was measured, the words heavy with disbelief. They turned destroying their daughter into a community sport. The town is horrified. The scandal of the secret Facebook group had unsettled the entire town, but Sarah knew it was not enough to let the revelations scatter in private shame. If there was one lesson she had learned, it was that abuse flourishes in silence. To dismantle it, she needed light spectacle and witnesses. That was why she began planning the charity gala, a $1,000 per plate evening under crystal chandeliers and golden lights, hosted in the most elegant ballroom in the city. On paper, it was a fundraiser for abandoned children. In reality, it was a stage designed to turn the tables to force her family to face the same public scrutiny they had once orchestrated against her. The invitations were sent carefully. She ensured her family's entire social circle received them, the very people who had once gossiped about her absence at barbecues and whispered about her supposed failures at church potlucks. They arrived in glittering gowns and tuxedos, murmuring about the honor of supporting Sarah's foundation, unaware of what awaited them. Even her parents and Michelle could not resist. Public image was too important to them. They arrived stiff-backed, smiling for photographers, thinking they were reclaiming ground simply by being seen. The night began with warmth and sincerity. Sarah moved gracefully through the tables, thanking donors, shaking hands. Her presence commanding but calm. The stage was decorated in understated elegance. Deep velvet curtains, a grand piano, and a large screen framed by soft light. When the dinner plates were cleared, Sarah took the stage to introduce the evening's program. Her voice was steady, almost tender, as she spoke of the Foundation's mission of children left behind not by circumstance, but by the people who should have protected them. The audience leaned forward, drawn in. Then came the testimonials. One by one, young people stood at the microphone. A teenage girl told of being left at a shelter when her mother's new partner decided she was a burden. A boy described being ignored by his family after coming out until strangers became his true home. The ballroom hushed as story after story revealed the quiet cruelties of abandonment. Tears streamed down faces. Even the servers paused their trays, forgotten. The emotional crescendo built until Sarah returned to the stage, her composure unshaken. She spoke slowly now, letting each word settle. Abandonment, she said, does not always happen in alleys or on doorsteps. Sometimes it happens in living rooms, in churches and schools. Sometimes it happens when laughter at your expense drowns out love. And with that, she gestured toward the screen. The lights dimmed, and the slideshow began. At first, the audience saw familiar faces, the same parents, siblings, and community members they had greeted at dinner parties. But then the screenshots appeared. Posts from the Managing Sarah group scrolled across the screen. Cruel jokes betting pools on her relationships. Strategies for undermining her confidence. Laughter that had once been private now echoed across a silent ballroom. Gasps rose from the audience. Whispers spread like fire. People turned to look at Sarah's parents, at Michelle, at the very faces they now recognized in those screenshots. Sarah did not flinch. She let the evidence speak. Comment after comment painted the picture of a campaign designed to break her. The culmination was a final slide, a group photo of her family smiling together, captioned with a message they had once written, "She'll never be one of us." Sarah let the silence hang for a long moment before stepping back to the microphone. Some children, she said softly, are abandoned by their living parents. The room erupted. Guests rose to their feet in a standing ovation, not only for her, but for the courage of every child and adult who had endured similar cruelty. Applause thundered, echoing through the ballroom as donors rushed to pledge support. By the end of the night, more than $2 million had been committed to her foundation, each dollar a rejection of cruelty and an affirmation of compassion. Meanwhile, her family scrambled. Faces red, they tried to slip out through side exits, pursued by whispers and sidelong glances. The perfect image they had clung to for decades was shattered beyond repair. Michelle's cheeks were streaked with tears. Her parents avoided every camera. They no longer looked like the enviable family they once pretended to be. They looked like what they had always been: small, mean, and exposed. Sarah watched them leave without moving to stop them. Her victory was not in their humiliation alone, but in what rose in its place, a community galvanized to choose kindness over cruelty. As the clapping subsided, she stepped forward one last time. her voice clear and steady carrying through the grand room. As family escapes in shame, Sarah announces, "Your generosity tonight proves that cruelty can be transformed into compassion. Thank you for choosing love over blood." The echoes of the charity gala were still reverberating when the collapse of Sarah's family system began in earnest. The polished veneer they had worn for decades cracked beyond repair under the weight of exposure, and what had been whispered behind closed doors now spilled into the open with no way to contain it. The very people who once took pride in projecting unity became locked in bitter conflict, tearing each other apart as they scrambled to assign blame. Her parents, who had always presented themselves as a team, began a cold war that spilled into daily shouting matches. Her mother accused her father of enabling Michelle's manipulation of standing by silently as their younger daughter consumed all the attention, all the resources, all the excuses. Her father retaliated with venom, throwing her long-hidden affair in her face, saying everything Sarah had unearthed was the result of her betrayal decades earlier. Years of suppressed resentment turned every meal into an interrogation and every conversation into a courtroom. The fractures extended quickly beyond their household. Extended family who had tolerated the favoritism for years suddenly distanced themselves once the evidence of fraud, cruelty, and calculated humiliation became public knowledge. Cousins who once attended every Christmas declined invitations. Aunts who defended them at family reunions withdrew entirely. Holiday traditions disintegrated in real time with invitations no longer extended, and silence filling the place of phone calls. Relatives who had benefited from their generosity suddenly found that association came at too high a social cost, and the family's proud lineage transformed into a cautionary tale whispered at gatherings. What had once been enviable connections, reputation influence turned toxic, leaving them socially exiled. The professional fallout compounded the isolation. Her mother, once hailed as a beloved teacher, now found her career permanently ruined. The school district's investigation ended in disgrace, her teaching license suspended, and the headlines branding her as a hypocrite lingered far longer than she imagined. She applied for part-time tutoring, but parents refused to trust their children to her. Meanwhile, her father's name had been blackened by scandal. After the hostile takeover of his company and the exposure of his financial misconduct, his job applications were quietly pushed aside. Every interview ended the same way, polite smiles followed by silence. His pride, once rooted in authority and provision, shrank under the weight of unemployment and financial ruin. Michelle's world unraveled with equal ferocity. Her marriage imploded after Sarah revealed her husband's secret longings, and the divorce proceedings dragged her reputation further through the mud. What once seemed like a picture-perfect family crumbled, leaving Michelle without a partner, without stability, and without the illusion that she had always clung to. Michelle's psychological fragility, long hidden behind charm and bravado, finally collapsed. The whispers about her diagnosis became reality when she suffered a public breakdown. Friends watched in shock as she screamed incoherently at a cafe, convinced Sarah was watching her through the windows. Within days, she was admitted to psychiatric care, her identity fractured by the loss of her marriage. Her children's shaken trust, and the sudden vacuum of support from parents, too consumed with their own survival. The sister who once mocked Sarah's seriousness now lay in a hospital bed, trembling under fluorescent lights, stripped of the masks she had worn for decades. The community response was swift and unforgiving. Neighbors who once waved warmly at her parents began turning away at the grocery store. Old friends who had shared holidays sent curt messages severing ties. Their church, once a refuge of image and reputation, quietly stopped calling on them for leadership or donations. Even casual acquaintances recoiled, unwilling to be linked with a family whose cruelty had become the centerpiece of local gossip. The circle they had built so carefully dissolved, leaving them adrift in a town where everyone knew their sins and few wanted to be associated with them. What emerged was total isolation. Each member of Sarah's family, once accustomed to relying on each other's silence and complicity, found themselves alone. Her father brooded in his recliner mail unopened around him, the phone silent. Her mother wept at night into an empty bed, replaying every decision that had led to this outcome. Michelle stared at hospital walls, clutching letters she never sent. Their support system, once fortified by denial and favoritism, had disintegrated. The fortress they had built by excluding Sarah turned into a prison that held only themselves. They were no longer a family, just fractured individuals bearing the consequences of their own choices. In the middle of this chaos, her mother broke. Fingers trembling, she typed a desperate text to Sarah. The first admission of defeat she had ever allowed. "Was destroying us always. Your plan." Sarah stared at the glowing screen, her breath steady, her heart no longer aching with the need for approval. Her reply was simple, calm, and final. "No. I just wanted you to love me. You chose destruction instead." The foreclosure notice arrived like a death knell for the family. The house where Sarah had grown up, the place where every childhood slight had occurred, every holiday she had been overlooked, was now marked for auction. Years of frozen assets, her father's ruined reputation, and her mother's lost career had left them unable to keep up with mortgage payments. The lawn that once showcased meticulous flower beds now bore weeds as tall as Sarah's knees, a fitting emblem of the decay that had been festering beneath their polished exterior. Neighbors whispered as they drove by, their eyes lingering on the faded shutters and the sagging porch swing. The story was no longer Sarah's private shame. It was public knowledge now. The mighty family that had once held their heads high at every community gathering had collapsed into financial ruin, and Sarah was watching every piece fall into place exactly as she had orchestrated. At the auction, Sarah didn't arrive herself. She sent representatives from a shell company quietly sitting at the back while the gavel pounded and voices rose. Her father sat 3 rows ahead, his head low, clutching a sheaf of papers like they might magically change the outcome. When the house was called, the bids started modestly, but Sarah's company was relentless, nudging the price higher with calm precision until the hammer struck and the property was hers. The irony was bitter and delicious. Her parents didn't even know their daughter had just bought the home out from under them. When the letter came weeks later, they thought it was good news. Their daughter's name wasn't on it, just Thompson Property Management. It stated they could remain in the home as tenants if they agreed to a strict lease, monthly inspections, timely payments at market rates, and a list of behavioral clauses Sarah had designed herself. Loud disputes, excessive drinking, or harassment of neighbors would constitute a violation. Rent was set at nearly double what they'd been paying for their mortgage. Her parents balked, but realized they had no choice. Pride didn't cover bills, and options were scarce. They signed, but the shame sat heavy. For the first time in their lives, they weren't homeowners. They were renters under their daughter's rule. Sarah didn't bother with courtesy visits. She managed everything through an app linked to her company. Each month, her parents received automated reminders and requests for photos documenting the property's condition. When her mother missed a deadline once, an immediate warning followed, violation noted. 2 more will result in eviction proceedings. The message was cold, bureaucratic, and perfectly impersonal, just as Sarah intended. She wasn't their child begging for love anymore. She was their landlord, and they were liabilities she tolerated. Neighbors noticed the change. Once Sarah's parents had been the ones looking down their noses at anyone who struggled financially. Now they were seen taking trash bins out with hunched shoulders, whispering to each other on the porch in tones filled with fear. Imagine one woman muttered at the grocery store, having to rent your own house. And from your daughter. The humiliation spread faster than wildfire. Invitations stopped coming. Former friends avoided eye contact. For Sarah, it wasn't just revenge, it was a mirror. Her parents were finally experiencing what they had inflicted on her all her life: rejection, isolation, and conditional acceptance. The true power lay not in the financial reversal, but in the rules. Each inspection, each reminder, each transaction was a reminder that they no longer controlled her life, she controlled theirs. When her father requested a minor repair for the leaky roof, the response was curt: per lease agreement, tenant is responsible for all maintenance under $1,000. He muttered about the unfairness of it all, but Sarah smiled when the notification appeared on her phone. Fairness had never been a principle her family lived by when she was the one begging for scraps of kindness. As weeks turned into months, Sarah realized she didn't need to be present to dominate the narrative. The house itself was a symbol now. She had turned their sanctuary into a cage, and they were the ones rattling the bars. They knew the truth deep down, though they pretended otherwise. Every creak of the old floorboards, every late-night inspection reminder, they carried her signature even without her name. The confrontation finally came one rainy evening. Sarah had scheduled a surprise inspection, sending a property manager to walk through the home. Her mother stood in the doorway, rain matting her hair to her forehead, her voice breaking with desperation. "You can't do this. You can't evict your own parents," she cried, the last vestige of authority clinging to her tone. But Sarah wasn't there in person. Her voice came through the app's intercom system, calm, clear, and devastatingly final. "You evicted me from your hearts first." The dust of the foreclosure and the humiliating role reversal at the family home had barely settled when the next move revealed itself. Sarah had anticipated that her parents and Michelle would not sit quietly under the weight of their own consequences. Pride had always been their compass, and she knew it would now steer them into reckless waters. It began quietly with whispers. Sarah's contacts in town started to report back to her. A retired uncle mentioned over coffee that her mother had approached him, asking if he might be willing to vouch for their side of the story if reporters came asking. Then came a phone call from a distant cousin in Florida, hesitant and awkward, admitting that Michelle had reached out with a long message about Sarah's vindictive crusade. Sarah listened calmly, taking notes. Each desperate attempt was not a threat, but more evidence of their unraveling. The real campaign launched 2 weeks later. Sarah's father, once a man who relied on subtle influence in the community, had scheduled meetings with an attorney hoping to challenge the foreclosure and even threaten defamation suits. What they hadn't counted on was how airtight Sarah's documentation was. Every forged signature, every stolen dollar, every message from the managing Sarah group had been archived and time-stamped. When their lawyer reviewed the folder Sarah's legal team provided in response, he understood the depth of their wrongdoing. Still at the beginning, the family clung to the illusion of a comeback. They spoke confidently to friends about fighting this injustice and hinted that Sarah's marriage to David was a calculated financial trap, painting her as the manipulative one. Sarah watched it unfold with a detached clarity that surprised even herself. The same people who once had all the power over her reputation now clawed to smear hers, failing to see that every story they spread only gave her opportunities to reveal more truth. When her parents told an old church friend that David's company was nothing more than smoke and mirrors, Sarah responded by releasing an independent audit report showing record-breaking profits and government contracts. When Michelle tried to convince old classmates that Sarah had a history of jealousy and sabotage, Sarah's investigator leaked screenshots of Michelle orchestrating Sarah's exclusion from family events years before. Each counterattack they attempted only deepened the hole they had dug. Their desperation grew more visible. They began reaching out to reporters, directly offering interviews that would set the record straight. But by this point, Sarah's charity work and media presence had established her as a voice of resilience and advocacy. Every time the family tried to paint themselves as victims, the public contrasted their words against Sarah's documented evidence and the goodwill she had built. Former neighbors who once looked up to her mother as a respected teacher now muttered in grocery aisles, turning away when they saw her father. Michelle's friends, once eager to be in her orbit, stopped returning her calls. Instead of rallying sympathy, their words sparked further disgust. As Sarah tracked each move, she realized this wasn't just about their cruelty to her. Their inability to own responsibility was the essence of why they had lost her long ago. They could not understand that accountability was the only currency that mattered now. Instead, they clung to old tactics, gossip, manipulation, appearances. Sarah's extended family, once silent bystanders, now openly voiced support for her. A cousin posted publicly that Sarah had always been the one paying bills when emergencies struck, that her parents had leaned on her financially for years while dismissing her worth. The tide had fully turned, and her parents didn't see it until it was too late. Michelle, in particular, grew reckless. She created burner social media accounts to post long rants about Sarah's lies, only to be exposed when investigators traced the accounts back to her IP address. Each discovery embarrassed her further, feeding the cycle of humiliation she was trying to escape. Her friends in the beauty startup world, already wary after her divorce, pulled away completely. She had gambled that slandering Sarah might restore some control, but instead it burned what little credibility she had left. The final blow came not from Sarah herself, but from the very lawyer the family had hired. After weeks of review, he called them in for a meeting. With a measured voice, he explained that their actions were indefensible, that the documents Sarah possessed would not only dismantle any legal challenge, but could open them to criminal liability if pushed. The family begged him to continue, promising they could find ways to spin the narrative. He slid the evidence folder across the table, shook his head, and delivered the words that extinguished the last spark of their fight. "I can't represent clients who've committed this level of documented abuse and fraud." For Sarah, the news was relayed by her legal team with a single line in an email: "Their lawyer has quit." She leaned back in her chair, folded her hands, and allowed herself the smallest smile. They had tried to strike back, but all they had done was prove her right. And this was only the beginning of the silence they would have to live with, a silence louder than any accusation they could hurl. "Their lawyer quits after reviewing the evidence. I can't represent clients who've committed this level of documented abuse and fraud." Sarah had expected that once the revelations had been made and the balance of power shifted, she would feel light-free, even triumphant. Yet in the weeks following the public humiliation of her family, a new weight settled in her chest. She found herself lying awake at night, staring at the ceiling, replaying not just their betrayals, but also her own orchestrated strikes against them. The gala had been a spectacle of justice, yes, but as the applause faded, Sarah wondered whether she had crossed an invisible line. David noticed the changes before she spoke them aloud. His quiet presence, his way of observing her without pressing, gave her the space to voice the question that haunted her. "What if I've become like them?" she asked one evening, her voice cracking. "What if all this revenge just makes me the monster they said I was?" David did not argue or dismiss her fear. Instead, he suggested something unexpected: therapy. "You don't have to carry this alone. Maybe it's time to sort out which battles were for justice and which were for pain." For the first time in her life, Sarah walked into a therapist's office, not because someone else had pushed her, but because she chose to confront herself. At first, she bristled under the therapist's gentle probing. When asked what she hoped to achieve through all her actions, Sarah found herself recounting every sting of her childhood, every slight, every dismissal. She realized she had orchestrated her retaliation less to destroy them and more to prove her worth, to force acknowledgement of what she had always been denied. Yet as she spoke, something inside shifted. The therapist pointed out the pattern Sarah had been fighting: ghosts, replaying battles with the little girl who was ignored at family dinners and overshadowed by Michelle. "The question isn't whether you've won," the therapist said softly. "It's whether you can stop fighting a war that doesn't exist anymore." Those words rattled Sarah more than any insult from her family ever had. She began to see that her revenge, while powerful, did not mend the hollow ache of being unloved. Complete destruction of her family would never rewrite the years of absence, never fill the silences where encouragement should have been. Healing, she realized, lay in something greater than their downfall. Slowly, she shifted her focus. Instead of spending nights reviewing legal documents and plotting, she spent them at the foundation offices, sitting with young people whose stories mirrored her own. Children abandoned not by death, but by choice. Adults who had clawed their way to independence with no family safety net. Listening to them, Sarah felt a resonance she had never known with her own blood. Their gratitude for her time and resources filled a space revenge never touched. David saw the difference in her posture and the way her eyes softened when she spoke about the foundation. "You don't need them anymore," he told her, his hand warm on hers. "You've already proven yourself 1,000 times over. The only approval left to win is your own." His words sank in deeply, not because they were new, but because she finally believed them. For weeks she had wrestled with the ethical question: was she delivering justice or simply inflicting suffering? The answer became clearer as she watched the lives her work was transforming. She no longer needed her family's ruin as proof of her strength. The thriving foundation, the hope in the eyes of those she helped, were proof enough. Yet the final test remained. On her desk sat a thick folder, her last revenge plan meticulously documented with steps that would strip her family of every shred of remaining dignity and financial standing. She had spent nights perfecting it, each page a weapon ready to launch. But now, holding it in her hands, she felt only weariness. She thought of the cycle, how they had lashed out from shame, how she had responded with vengeance, and how endless it could become. She remembered her therapist's words: "The war doesn't exist anymore." David came into the room just as she laid the folder flat on the desk. He didn't ask what she was thinking, only watched as she traced her hand across the cover. Her heart pounded as she realized this was the true moment of power, not in carrying out the plan, but in choosing not to. Taking a breath, Sarah tore the folder in half, then again scattering the pieces into the trash. She spoke aloud as if her family were in the room, her voice steady, almost calm. "I refuse to become them, but I also refuse to be their victim ever again." Sarah's therapist had told her that the most difficult part of recovery wasn't letting go of anger, but deciding what to do with the silence that followed. In the weeks since she had torn her final revenge plan into pieces, Sarah carried herself differently. There was a steadiness to her, a sense of control that didn't come from the destruction she had caused, but from the clarity she now held. Yet she knew there was one final thread left to tie or cut forever. Her family was fractured, their reputations in ruins, their finances drained, their social circles gone. But Sarah understood that walking away without a word might leave doors cracked open for manipulation excuses or half-hearted attempts to worm their way back. If she wanted peace, she needed to create it on her own terms. That was when she began drafting what she called the redemption offer. She sat at her desk late into the night, pen scratching across thick paper. Each condition she wrote was deliberate, unflinching. Family therapy was non-negotiable. Not a single session, but a long-term commitment to unlearning toxic behaviors that had poisoned their household for decades. Financial restitution was next, every dollar stolen from her through forged signatures, unauthorized charges, or inheritance manipulation would be paid back in full with interest into her foundation for abandoned children. Public accountability followed the most painful requirement of all. If they wanted any relationship with her in the future, they would have to admit publicly, not in whispers or half-truths, that they had abandoned their daughter on her wedding day, exploited her generosity, and tried to sabotage her life. Finally, she added behavioral clauses, promises to respect boundaries, to treat her husband with dignity, and to never again belittle her achievements. Her hand trembled only slightly as she wrote the section labeled consequences. If they refused, the severance would be permanent. No contact, no inclusion in her future children's lives, no shared family legacy. They would remain as strangers, stripped of the illusion of blood ties, replaced only by silence. She even detailed legal measures, trusts drawn up to ensure they could never benefit financially from her success. It was a declaration that their access to her was not a right, but a privilege contingent on respect. When David read the document, he raised his eyes to hers with quiet pride. "This isn't revenge," he said softly. "This is law. The law of your life." Sarah nodded, feeling the truth of it. For once, she wasn't acting from the hollow ache of a wounded daughter, but from the firm ground of a woman who finally knew her worth. Still, she anticipated the storm her offer would unleash. Pride was the lifeblood of her family, and admitting fault publicly would cut deeper than any financial loss or social humiliation. She imagined her father gritting his teeth, her mother's voice rising in shrill denial, Michelle collapsing under the weight of her own guilt. Yet she also imagined a sliver of possibility that perhaps buried beneath their stubborn pride, one or more of them might choose humility, might choose change. That thought alone gave her enough resolve to send the offer. The responses began to trickle in before the meeting was even set. Her father, weary and broken by professional disgrace, wrote back first. "I'll do what you ask." His note reads simple and stripped of the authority he once wielded over her life. "Just let me keep a place in it." Her mother's reply came next, fiery and defensive. "How dare you demand I humiliate myself? I raised you. You wouldn't be who you are without me." Michelle's answer was the most conflicted paragraphs of tear-stained text messages torn between resentment and genuine remorse, begging for a chance to prove she could change. The debate spread beyond their immediate family. Cousins called, trying to persuade Sarah that her terms were too harsh. An aunt pleaded with her not to cut ties forever. But Sarah held firm. She explained calmly that forgiveness did not erase accountability, and love without respect was just manipulation in disguise. She had lived a lifetime in the shadows of their excuses. She would not step back into them again. The weight of their choices now lay with them, not her. That was the freedom she had carved for herself. Whether they swallowed their pride and stepped into the light of accountability, or clung to their bitterness and chose estrangement, she would no longer bend to their silence or cruelty. On a quiet Sunday morning, Sarah sealed the final letters, each addressed in her careful handwriting. Inside, they would find the terms in black and white, undeniable and unchangeable. She pressed the wax seal with deliberate force, feeling the circle harden beneath her thumb. When she lifted the envelope and set it aside with the others, a calm certainty washed over her. Her voice was steady as she whispered the words aloud, as if they were meant for her family and herself at once. One meeting. One choice. Choose family through accountability, or remain strangers through pride. The evening of the final meeting arrived with an almost surreal stillness, as if the air itself was holding its breath. Sarah had chosen the location deliberately, a modest family restaurant that once held memories of her childhood triumphs. She could still picture herself as a girl sitting at one of the corner tables, clutching an award from school, hoping for words of praise that never came. Tonight, the place would serve a different purpose. It would not be a celebration of her achievements, but a courtroom of truth, and she was both the witness and the judge. The smell of familiar dishes hung in the air, mingling with the tension that vibrated through the room. Her family arrived one by one, each carrying the weight of the scandal that had unraveled their lives. Her father shuffled in first, shoulders bent, his once proud posture replaced by the fatigue of disgrace. Michelle followed, her eyes red from nights of sleeplessness and the humiliation of a broken marriage. Their mother was last dressed as if she still had a reputation to protect. Her chin lifted in defiance, though her eyes betrayed unease. They sat at the table that Sarah had reserved, the same one where she had once begged for their attention. This time they would give her their full attention, whether they wished to or not. Sarah began without preamble. She opened a folder, methodically pulling out documents, photographs, and transcripts. One by one, she laid them on the table, her voice steady as she recounted their betrayals in chronological order. She spoke of stolen inheritances, of years of sabotage, of public humiliation planned in secret groups. She played recordings of their voices mocking her and displayed financial records that exposed decades of theft masked as family emergencies. Each revelation landed like a stone in water, ripples of discomfort spreading across the table. No one could interrupt, not when the evidence was so undeniable. Her father was the first to speak. His voice cracked under the weight of shame as he admitted that he had known about the inheritance theft, but had been too weak to resist Michelle's mother's insistence. He offered to make amends privately, whispering that he would try to find ways to return what was rightfully hers. But his plea sounded small compared to the magnitude of the harm. Sarah listened, her expression calm, but she did not grant him absolution. Private apologies would not undo years of public damage. Michelle's response was different. Tears welled in her eyes as she confessed in halting words the jealousy that had driven her to undermine her sister for so long. She admitted to wanting Sarah's life, her successes, even her resilience. "I didn't want to hurt you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I wanted to be you. But you were always better at being yourself than I ever was." For the first time, Sarah felt a flicker of something close to empathy, but she knew remorse was not enough. Michelle's words would need to be followed by actions. Their mother, however, refused to bend. She crossed her arms and dismissed the evidence as exaggeration, insisting that every choice she made was for the good of the family. When Sarah laid out the cruel social media posts, the mother scoffed. "So what, families fight? You're just airing dirty laundry." Even when faced with undeniable proof of her orchestration in the abandonment, she refused to take responsibility. Her pride would not allow her to acknowledge fault, not even when everything around her had crumbled. The differences in their responses revealed the truth Sarah had always known but never wanted to face. Not everyone was capable of change. Her father's guilt was tinged with cowardice. Michelle's remorse carried a fragile hope, and her mother's defiance showed a heart locked away behind walls of arrogance. Sarah realized in that moment that love could not be forced, and respect could not be begged into existence. It had to be earned, and they had squandered every opportunity to earn hers. The weight of the decision lay heavy on her, but it was also liberating. She no longer needed to chase what they would not give. She could see clearly now who they were when stripped of excuses. Their choices were their own, just as hers would be. For the first time, she felt no desperation to make them see her value. They had seen it and rejected it, and that rejection said more about them than it ever would about her. The silence stretched across the table after she finished. Forks scraped against plates as other diners carried on with their meals, oblivious to the reckoning unfolding in the corner booth. Sarah folded her hands on the table and waited, giving them one last chance to speak truth, to show courage, to choose accountability over pride. The moment was theirs to seize, but she would no longer beg for it. At last her mother leaned forward, her voice sharp as a blade. "I gave you life," she said, her words cutting through the stillness. "That should be enough." Sarah met her eyes without flinching, her voice quiet but firm, steady as the ground beneath her feet. "You gave me pain," she answered. "That's why it isn't." The restaurant confrontation had drained Sarah more than she expected, but in a way it also gave her clarity. Watching each family member squirm, deflect, or in rare moments admit their failings confirmed what she had known. Deep down there was nothing left to fight for. For decades she had fought for recognition, for scraps of affection, for even the illusion of respect. But now, after laying out the evidence and listening to their excuses, she realized the struggle was over. She no longer needed their approval to define her worth. Walking out of that building was less a retreat than a release. The first thing she did once she was home was simple but symbolic. She picked up her phone, opened her contacts list, and deleted every number that tied her to them. Her parents, Michelle, even the extended relatives who had chosen silence instead of support. Each deletion felt like a cut thread from a net that had once tangled her, and by the end of it she felt lighter. She followed it with a practical step, updating her emergency contacts. Where her parents' names had lingered out of habit, she now wrote in Maria's and David's father's. It was more than housekeeping. It was her formal declaration of who she trusted with her life. Next came the legal protections. Sarah contacted her attorney and made it official her will, once generously including her parents, and Michelle was rewritten to remove them entirely. Every asset from her business shares to her personal savings would instead be secured for her foundation and for David. The message was clear: those who had abandoned her had no claim to her legacy. If they wanted to gamble on her failure, they had lost that bet. She left no space for loopholes or manipulation. Any future contact would be filtered through lawyers. She would not allow them another opening to steal her peace or her money. In those quiet hours, she reflected on her emotional state. What surprised her most was the absence of rage. The sharp sting that had once consumed her heart was gone. In its place there was a calm, almost serene acceptance. For so long she had imagined this moment as one of triumph fueled by anger and vindication. But instead it felt like standing on a shore after a long storm. The sea was finally still and she could breathe. She had not simply destroyed their power over her, she had stepped out of their shadow entirely. David noticed the difference immediately. When she told him about the deletions and the will, he expected tears or second-guessing. Instead, she spoke with steady certainty. "It's done," she said, not as a lament, but as a declaration. He wrapped her in his arms, recognizing that his wife had finally broken the cycle of craving validation. She no longer needed to prove herself. She was enough with or without them. That realization was the truest victory she could ever claim. Her chosen family stepped forward almost instinctively to fill the space left behind. Maria cooked dinner the next evening and invited friends over, creating a warm circle of laughter and care. David's parents called to say how proud they were of the way she had handled herself, and his mother reminded her, "Family isn't who shares your blood, honey. It's who shares your burdens." Sarah felt a swell of gratitude that these people who owed her nothing gave her everything she had ever wanted from those bound by blood. The foundation work also offered her a new chapter to pour her energy into. Instead of exhausting herself on people who resented her success, she poured her heart into children and adults who had lived her same kind of abandonment. With every story she heard, every life she touched, her own pain transformed into purpose. It wasn't revenge that healed her. It was turning her scars into bridges for others to cross into safety. Standing in the rain-soaked parking lot one evening, after a long day at the foundation, Sarah paused by her car. The sky was gray droplets running down her coat, but she felt lighter than she ever had. She slipped her wedding ring off for a moment and stared at it, the gold glinting beneath the dim streetlight. For years she had longed to wear a ring that symbolized belonging. Now it didn't just symbolize a marriage, it represented a choice. She slid it back on her finger, her voice steady against the patter of rain. "I choose the family that chose me." Would you like me to also adjust the pacing of this part, slightly leaning heavier into her emotional closure, rather than the procedural steps, so that it resonates even more with an older American audience who values reflection and resolution? Sarah walked away from the storm of her family's collapse with a clarity she had never known. For the first time in her life, she no longer sought their validation, no longer twisted herself into impossible shapes for scraps of affection. What began as a small act of self-preservation, choosing not to answer their calls, not to reopen old wounds, grew into something far greater. Her foundation, Bridges Over Blood, which she and David had launched in the early days of her healing, began to swell with momentum. What was once a modest program offering resources for abandoned children now stretched across the country. Within 3 years, it became a national organization operating in multiple states, helping thousands of children and adults who had been discarded by their families or made to feel invisible. The stories she encountered mirrored her own in haunting ways. A teenager cast aside for refusing to follow family traditions. A woman in her 60s still aching from a mother who told her she was never good enough. Each story reinforced Sarah's belief that her suffering had meaning, that she was meant to build something from the ashes. She invested her energy, her connections, and her voice into the cause, ensuring that the foundation offered not just financial support, but therapy, mentorship, and safe communities for those left behind by the people who should have loved them most. Her advocacy naturally expanded beyond the walls of her organization. Invited to give a TEDx talk, Sarah stood under the spotlight and told her story in raw, unflinching detail. She spoke of betrayal not as an end, but as a beginning, a chance to claim one's worth independent of blood ties. The talk went viral, viewed by millions. Soon she was approached by a publishing house, and her memoir became a bestseller, resonating especially with women who had endured decades of invisible wounds. She testified before lawmakers advocating for reforms to inheritance laws and the legal recognition of emotional abuse. Her voice, once dismissed at her own family table, now carried weight in halls of power. But Sarah never allowed herself to drift too far from the personal. Beyond cameras and podiums, she sat with women who came to her broken and uncertain, guiding them through the same darkness she once faced. She taught them to set boundaries without guilt, to recognize manipulation for what it was, and to choose relationships that nourished rather than drained them. Many evenings she stayed late at the Foundation's community center, sipping coffee with survivors as they shared their first tentative hopes for a future without fear. The systemic impact of her work was undeniable. Several states passed legislation directly influenced by her advocacy, tightening protections around inheritance rights and mandating greater oversight of financial guardianship. Emotional abuse, once dismissed as intangible, was increasingly recognized in family court. Sarah saw in these victories not just policy changes, but the validation that cruelty in the home could no longer be excused as just family business. At home, her marriage deepened under the weight and beauty of their shared mission. David, always her steady anchor, supported her through every speech, every painful memory unearthed, every public battle. Their partnership evolved into something unshakable, built not just on love, but on mutual respect for each other's resilience. In their private moments, they created the intimacy Sarah had always longed for. Sunday dinners filled with laughter, quiet mornings with coffee in hand, and dreams of the family they would build together. And they did build one, though not in the traditional sense. Maria and her husband became like siblings, their children calling Sarah Aunt. David's parents embraced Sarah as a daughter in every way her own parents never had. They created new traditions, holidays filled with warmth, birthdays celebrated with chosen family, and annual retreats, where their circle came together to celebrate not blood, but chosen bonds. The cycle of dysfunction that Sarah had endured stopped with her. In its place grew something rooted in love, respect, and accountability. Through it all, Sarah carried herself with a calm authority that people gravitated toward. She had been tested by cruelty and come out unbroken, and that strength radiated in every word she spoke. She had turned her pain into purpose, her abandonment into a bridge for others to cross. Yet for all her achievements, she remained grounded, never losing sight of the girl who once cried in a wedding dress, believing she was unworthy of love. That girl, Sarah knew, had built the woman she was now. At the Foundation's annual gala, as she prepared to give her keynote, Sarah scanned the glittering ballroom filled with donors, survivors, and supporters. The applause quieted, and before she could step onto the stage, a young woman approached her, tears glistening in her eyes. She grasped Sarah's hand tightly and whispered, "Your story saved my life. I left my abusive family because of you." In the years that followed, the dust of Sarah's public reckoning with her family finally settled, leaving behind the reality of what her choices meant for each of them. Her father, once the proud figure who had dismissed her accomplishments and stolen her inheritance, now lived a diminished life. Stripped of his company, stripped of respect, he worked part-time at a hardware store to keep food on the table. He arrived each morning with hunched shoulders and avoided the eyes of men who had once looked up to him as a leader. Pride had been his armor for decades, and now it had dissolved into shame. Though he told neighbors he was managing fine, everyone knew he was surviving on fragments of what once was. Her mother fared no better. Once celebrated in the community as a dedicated teacher, she now carried the weight of disgrace wherever she went. Friends crossed the street rather than greet her parents, whispered when she entered the grocery store, and invitations to neighborhood events vanished. The social exile was permanent. In her solitude, she clung to the illusion that she had been wronged, refusing to take accountability for years of cruelty. Even when others offered her a chance at reconciliation, she remained bitter, convinced that her downfall was orchestrated rather than deserved. Michelle's story unfolded differently. The breakdown that once shattered her life forced her into long-term therapy. For the first time, she confronted not only her actions toward Sarah, but also the deep insecurities and disorders that had fueled her behavior. Therapy was grueling, peeling back years of envy and manipulation. But slowly, she began to rebuild herself. Her divorce from Tom had been devastating, yet it also freed her from the toxic validation she had chased for so long. Week by week, Michelle learned to live without competing, without needing to steal Sarah's light to feel whole. One day she sat with her therapist and wrote a letter, pages of apology, admission, and vulnerability addressed to her sister. She mailed it, though she never knew if Sarah would open it. Not all outcomes were paths to growth. Extended relatives who had once participated in the cruel managing Sarah group tried to distance themselves from the scandal, but whispers never fully disappeared. Some remained stubborn, still murmuring excuses that family business should have stayed private, while others learned their lesson using Sarah's story as a warning to treat their own children with fairness. The tale of the Thompsons became a local cautionary legend, proof of how favoritism, deceit, and cruelty could rot a family from the inside until nothing was left but ruin. For Sarah, observing these consequences stirred complicated emotions. There were days when sadness crept in not for what she lost, but for what could have been. She sometimes imagined an alternate world where her parents celebrated her wedding, where Michelle stood beside her not as a rival, but as a sister, where love outweighed envy. Those thoughts were fleeting, tempered by the unshakable knowledge that she had done what she needed to do to break free. Regret never anchored her because every choice she made had led her toward peace, truth, and the creation of a new kind of family, one she could trust. Amid these reflections, Sarah learned more about her biological father through papers and business records she uncovered. He had been a driven entrepreneur building his wealth through persistence and creativity. The parallels were striking. His work ethic mirrored her own. His independence echoed in the very choices that had shaped her life. Reading about him was like seeing a part of herself reflected back, proof that she had never been an outlier in her family by accident. Her determination, her relentless pursuit of success had been inherited, not stolen. That discovery brought a quiet comfort, filling in a piece of the puzzle that had haunted her since childhood. As the years unfolded, Sarah built her legacy, while her family lived in the shadows of their actions. Their lives had fractured along the lines of accountability and pride, some finding ways to heal, others sinking deeper into bitterness. Sarah no longer carried the burden of fixing them. She had chosen herself, her marriage, her foundation, and her chosen family instead. But the past never fully disappeared. One afternoon, as she returned from a board meeting, she found an envelope in her mailbox. It was from Michelle, the handwriting shaky but unmistakable. Sarah held it in her hands for a long time, weighing the history it carried, the pain it might reopen, the sincerity it might contain. She placed it on her desk without breaking the seal, whispering to herself, "Some bridges can be rebuilt. Others need to stay burned." 3 years later, the air around Sarah's life carried no trace of the chaos that once consumed her. The battles with her parents and sister, the humiliations, the courtroom whispers, all of it had faded into the rearview mirror of a woman who chose not just to survive, but to create something better. In their place stood a different world, one she had carefully built with David, brick by brick, laugh by laugh, moment by moment. Their home was perched on the edge of a quiet neighborhood filled with trees and gardens, the kind of place where children played safely in the street and neighbors waved warmly across hedges. It was here that Sarah began her true family portrait. In the mornings, sunlight streamed across the polished wood floors of their home, filling it with a warmth that seemed to belong as much to Sarah's spirit as to the architecture. She would wake to the sound of her daughter's laughter, a sound she once thought she would never hear in her life. The little girl with David's thoughtful eyes and Sarah's unyielding smile was a daily reminder that the legacy of cruelty Sarah endured had been broken. She wrapped her daughter in unconditional love, the kind of affection Sarah had always longed for, but rarely received in her own childhood. Every bedtime story, every gentle correction, every whispered "I love you" carried the weight of that promise her daughter would never doubt her worth. Parenthood transformed Sarah into a different woman altogether. Where she once sought validation from her family through sacrifice and silence, now she found confidence in nurturing a child who never had to question her mother's pride. With David, she built rituals that reflected their own values. Sunday morning, pancake breakfasts in the kitchen with messy counters and sticky fingers. Friday evening walks around the neighborhood, holding hands, yearly trips, not to impress anyone but to explore and learn together. It wasn't just parenting, it was healing piece by piece through the everyday joys of a household that truly belonged to her. The concept of chosen family expanded far beyond Sarah, David, and their daughter. Maria, who had stood by Sarah from the very beginning, became the aunt her daughter adored. David's parents, once distant acquaintances, had grown into second parents for Sarah, offering the kind of steady encouragement she never knew as a child. The foundation staff, volunteers, and even some of the young women Sarah mentored formed a wider circle of belonging. Holidays were no longer occasions of dread or strained dinners. They became vibrant gatherings filled with music, food, and stories told late into the night where people clinked glasses, not because tradition demanded it, but because they genuinely cherished being together. At the same time, Sarah's work with the foundation had grown into something larger than she had ever imagined. Bridges Over Blood became a national name, its programs reaching thousands of children and adults who had been emotionally abandoned by their families. Laws changed because of her advocacy, states passing measures that strengthened protections against financial exploitation within families and acknowledged the psychological harm of abandonment. Her TEDx talk had been viewed millions of times, her book translated into several languages, and her testimony before Congress played a role in shifting national conversations about what family truly meant. But Sarah always emphasized one thing in every public appearance: her mission was not revenge, but transformation. She had turned her suffering into service, and that was her truest triumph. Her marriage to David deepened through this shared mission. He was no longer just her husband. He was her partner in every sense of the word. They celebrated victories together, whether it was the passage of a new law or their daughter's first school play, with equal joy. Their relationship carried a quiet strength built not on appearances, but on the knowledge that they had survived storms together and chosen love each day afterward. For Sarah, this bond was more powerful than any validation she once chased from her parents. With David, she was enough. With their daughter, she was whole. Traditions sprouted naturally from their new life. Each New Year's Eve, Sarah and her chosen family wrote letters of gratitude and burned them in the fireplace, letting smoke carry their thanks into the sky. On her daughter's birthdays, Sarah would plant a tree in the backyard, each sapling a living testament to growth, resilience, and hope. These customs were simple but meaningful, designed not for show, but for continuity, for roots that ran deeper than blood ever had. They created a sense of legacy that Sarah knew would endure for generations, one based on love freely given, not withheld as leverage. One warm afternoon, the backyard filled with laughter and the scent of grilled food, Sarah watched her daughter playing on a swing set David had built. Maria and her husband shared stories on the patio. David's parents passed plates of food around, and volunteers from the foundation mingled with neighbors. It was noisy, imperfect, full of interruptions and spilled drinks and sticky children's hands. And it was perfect. Sarah stood there, letting the scene wash over her, realizing this was the life she had always deserved. As the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, her daughter hopped off the swing, ran over, and tugged at Sarah's dress. With wide, innocent eyes, the little girl asked Mommy, "What about your first family?" The question, so simple, carried echoes of all the years of pain, rejection, and longing. For a moment, Sarah's heart tightened, but then she looked up and saw David pushing the swing, gently smiling back at her with steady reassurance, surrounded by the people who had shown up, stayed, and loved her without condition. Sarah knelt, brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's forehead. She smiled not with bitterness, but with the quiet certainty of someone who had found her truth at last. "Sweetheart," she said softly, "this is my first family. My real family. Everyone before was just practice." And that brings us to the end of Sarah's journey, a story of heartbreak, betrayal, resilience, and ultimately triumph. She turned the cruelty of her family into the foundation of a new life built on strength, love, and the kind of family that shows up when it matters. But her story doesn't just belong to her. It reflects the struggles so many people face when those who should protect us become the ones who wound us the most. The question is, what would you have done if you were in Sarah's place? Would you have chosen revenge, forgiveness, or walked away the moment they showed their true colors? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Every perspective adds a new layer to this conversation, and your story could help someone else who feels alone in their own struggles. If Sarah's journey resonated with you, if it made you think about the meaning of family strength and healing, make sure to subscribe to the channel. We share stories just like this, raw, emotional, and powerful, where ordinary people face extraordinary challenges and emerge transformed. Don't miss the next one. Now tell me what part of Sarah's journey struck you the hardest, and what lesson will you carry with you from her story?